Good morning. If everyone could please take their seat, I'd like to call this Basic Education Funding Commission meeting to order. And Ms. Wilkin, can you please call the roll?
Argel, Delgado,
Here.
Fitterer,
Here.
Hughes, Isaacson, Krug,
Here.
Miller, Ortitai,
Here.
Phillips-Hill,
Here.
Rothman, Schweier, Sturla, Topper, Warner, Williams.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wilkin. I'm Kristen Phillips-Hill, State Senator from the 28th District representing Southern York County, and I have the honor of co-chairing this commission alongside my fellow co-chair, the gentleman from Lancaster County, Representative Sturla. We were in Pittsburgh yesterday, thanks to Senator Williams, and heard excellent testimony on career readiness and prioritizing positive student outcomes. Today is the 8th meeting of this commission since we started taking our meetings on the road to hear from stakeholders all across the state. And we have a robust agenda today. And before we begin, I would like to turn it over to my co-chair, Representative Sturla, for opening remarks.
Thank you. I want to thank all the testifiers in advance because what we've been finding out is that we have in some cases, some preconceived ideas of how things maybe should be, and sometimes those things align with what we hear is actually happening out in the real world, and other times we hear that maybe we need to tweak our thinking a little bit, and so it's been very enlightening, and I hope that we can look forward to hearing some more good testimony today, particularly about the rural schools, and I know we have the superintendent coming down from Erie because of proximity, so I look forward to the testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Would like to thank our co-hosts for today, Representatives Jason Ortitai and Ryan Warner. And gentlemen, I will defer to you for any additional opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Obviously, this is not my district, but when the hearings came up, Representative Warner and I decided to do a joint one, and we picked his district. This is a wonderful campus and a great location. We were talking about that before, but I'm really excited to dive into this, and for the interest of time, I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank everybody for coming out, my colleagues from across the Commonwealth for joining us here in Fayette County. I do have to tip my cap to Representative Krupa. This is actually her district, formerly my district. It is on the border, but Penn State Fayette is a beautiful campus, and I do want to thank them for hosting us here today, and I'm very much looking forward to today's testimony.
Thank you, representatives, and thank you to Penn State Fayette. This is a really ideal location to hold today's hearing. Would like to welcome our testifiers who have spent a considerable amount of time on their respective testimonies and thank them for lending their expertise to our commission and helping us accomplish our shared bipartisan goals. And with that, I would like to call up our first testifier, Mr. Matthew Jospeh, who is the Senior Policy Advisor with Excel in Ed. Matthew is joining us virtually, and Mr. Jospeh, if you could, before you begin, can we swear you in? Do you
Yes.
swear, thank you, please raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And if so, please indicate by saying, I do.
I do.
Thank you very much, and please proceed with your testimony when you are ready.
Thank you very much, and honorable members of the Basic Education Commission. As the chair mentioned, my name is Matthew Jospeh, and I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Education Funding at Excel in Ed, which was a nonprofit organization founded in 2008, and we provide education policy solutions to states across the country. In my role, I advise state policymakers on how they can structure their school funding systems to maximize student outcomes. Over many years, there's been a big question about whether money matters in education, and it's produced fiercely partisan answers. Some have argued that increased funding is necessary to improve inadequate student outcomes. Others have noted that despite increases in school spending nationwide over several decades, student achievement has remained largely flat. More recently, there's been more sophisticated research done on this topic. And there has been a remarkable consensus developing across the ideological spectrum that when there is increased spending, there is improvement in student outcomes, but that the state policies are needed to significantly increase the size of the impact that can occur. The two big bodies of research that have happened, one has been led by Jackson and the other by Eric Hanushek, and they have looked at all the different studies out there where there have been increases in funding across the whole country. And what they have found is that when there is an increase of funding of about $1,000 per student, there is an increase in student achievement. It's small, but it's statistically significant. There is an increase, and that increase is double for low-income students. But what they've also found is a large range of results that what they have looked at, they produce numbers, but those numbers are the average. And what they have found is a large range where it can go as low as zero impact to much higher than the average. And they've also looked at what's the kind of impact when you see evidence-based interventions like reduced class size or some of the science of reading whole school interventions. And what they see is impact much higher than the average. So the question people have asked is, well, what can a state do to not be at the average, but to be at the higher end of the average, can be even to this part of the spectrum where the evidence-based interventions are? And what they have determined is that it really is the role of state policy. That is, it is the existence, the adoption and effective implementation of certain state policies that drive the impact of funding to the highest levels that are possible. And I just give you an example from Dr. Jackson. He said, importantly, we find that how the money is spent may be important. As such, to be most effective, it is likely that spending increases should be coupled with systems that ensure spending is allocated towards the most productive inputs. And what are some of those policies? There's a fair degree of understanding what some of those policies are, and I'll just list a few of them quickly. One of them is a simple, transparent funding formula, student-centered funding formula, where the money goes out based on the number of students a district has, the types of students they have, because what they have found is that when school leaders and district leaders fully understand why they're getting the money, how much money they're getting, and they have flexibility in how to use that money, the impact on student outcomes is the highest. A part of that is that the differentiation of funding based on student types, which is that, for example, higher funding for students who have higher needs, like low-income students. Almost every state in the country does that, and Excel and Ed did a survey of this last year and found that 44 states provide supplemental funding for low-income students, for example. And what they typically do is they have a base amount and they apply a weight or multiplier on top of that base to produce that supplemental amount. The average across the whole country is 22% higher, which is producing about $1,200 extra per low-income students. And I know that, for example, in Pennsylvania, the amount is much lower than that because there's a weight, but it applies only to a much lower base. So when you, for example, have a $7,000 student base and you apply a 1.2 multiplier, it's $1,400 per student. But when you have that applied to only $700, it's producing a much smaller amount. The third policy that folks have identified relates to this is that since the impact is so much higher for the low-income students in the studies that have been found, is that when you do have that supplemental money in a funding formula, it's critical to get it to those students, get it to the schools that are serving those students, because without some kind of additional policy, the money goes to the district level and the districts can decide how to spend the money. And they most often will not direct it to the neediest students. And so what states are doing is they're requiring that the money get to the schools that are serving the higher needs students, that money follows them there. The fourth policy that has been identified is accountability for outcomes. In other words, to say to the state policymakers, you can be lighter on the inputs if you are tighter and more exacting on accountability for outcomes. And what that typically means in a state like Florida, which is where Excel and Ed is based, is that every school is given an accountability grade of A to F. And it's measured not only on how you're doing for all your students, but how you're doing for your higher needs students also. You can't get the highest grade unless you're doing well for all your students. And another aspect of accountability that states are doing is performance funding. They're saying we're going to link some of our money actually to the achievement of student outcomes. You're going to get more money if your students do better than if they don't do better. And this is started in Texas a few years ago. Now Tennessee just adopted it. And it's based on, in those two states, it's based on how the graduates are doing. Are they graduating college and career ready? And if they do graduate college career ready, the districts are getting a bonus. And if they are doing that with higher need students, like lower income students or students with disability, that bonus is even higher. And policymakers are saying, well, this is a great investment for us because we're only spending money if the students are doing well. And the last one that I wanted to highlight is financial transparency, to allow schools across a state to identify comparable schools. These are schools that look like us. They have similar demographics to us. And they are getting the same amount of money as we are, but they are actually getting much better results. And so we want to find out, like, what is that other school doing? It is possible. They can see those other schools exist. They're getting better outcomes for the same or fewer resources. Now let's find out, what are these schools doing differently to help them understand that? So what I typically say to states is, like, how do they know what the impact of an increased investment is going to be? It's really to take a look at these policies. If a state only has a few of those policies that are really weakly implemented, the results are going to be at the tail end of the results that Dr. Hanushek and Dr. Jackson found, which is pretty close to zero. If they have some of those policies and they're doing a pretty good job of implementation, those results could be at the average, and which is significant, and double for low-income students. But to be at the higher end, to be at the end, the higher end of that range that they have found, and closer to where the evidence-based interventions are, they need to have a larger number of those policies and implementing them well. To make it a little easier for state policymakers, we at ExcelNet have a basic diagnostic tool that can be used to kind of go through the set of policies and to kind of identify which ones do a state have, which ones is it doing a good job of implementing it, and where is there room for improvement. And of course, we're always available to provide additional resources to the state and to the commission. My colleague Ashley is on the phone, and she's in Pennsylvania. She works in Pennsylvania for ExcelNet, and there's folks on my team that can help provide additional resources to you and to the state as it would consider some of these issues. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over for any questions and clarifications that I can provide. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Representative Sturla, question?
Thank you. You point out that additional dollars for low-income students actually has a double the impact. And in a state like Pennsylvania, where part of our issue has been that it's the low-income districts that are underfunded, and there's people that say, well, gee, money doesn't really matter. It obviously, in those low-income districts, matters more than in a wealthy district or a district that already has a lot of dollars. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's really about the student population. I mean, wherever that student is, whatever district there is, they're finding that when the investment goes and is directed, through those weights and through that requirement that the schools get the money that for their students, that's where they see the double the impact of in other circumstances.
Okay. And then one follow-up question. You pointed out that the multipliers used for weighted students is multipliers on the base. And in Pennsylvania, our base started out as the most inequitable formula in the entire state. We took a base that said we're going to lock in a year where we were considered not just 50th in the nation, but 51st in the nation. And so it really exemplified to me the point that base really needs to be a fair base if we're going to do our multipliers times that base, because otherwise we're just multiplying times a really unfair base. And we're throwing the numbers off even farther. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the math issue, like, of course, you could have a much, much higher multiplier if your base is high. You could have a multiplier of 20, or something that's much, much higher than the national average. But, if you want to have a weight that's closer to the national average and produce the results of the national average, then you need to have a higher base to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Ortitai.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony. I was going through, and I think I'm on page 2 here under the chart, where I think you said the quote, "Importantly, we find that how the money is spent may be important as such. To be most effective, it is likely that spending increases should be coupled with systems that ensure spending is allocated toward the most productive inputs." Is that quote more suggesting focuses and what other states have done, focuses on particular programs or particular policies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that they're more generally saying what can we do to encourage the most effective resources, not necessarily effective use of the resources, not necessarily like a specific program. But the question becomes, and I do get asked this quite a bit, like if we know that there are certain programs out there that are super effective, what can a state do to make sure that those programs are implemented? And I guess there's definitely ways a state can do it. Other states are doing it to kind of encourage, incentivize, to facilitate, and to restrict choices if schools aren't doing well. To say if you're a low performing school, we're going to restrict the number of choices. But I don't think any state has said there's one magic formula that it's got to be this particular program. That's the one that you have to do across the whole state to do that. But there's definitely like efforts to kind of push schools in those directions.
All right, thank you.
Senator Williams.
Thank you. Your testimony highlights that there's consensus that spending increases help low-income students. Here in Pennsylvania, the 100 most underfunded districts serve nearly 60% of Pennsylvania's students in poverty. Those 100 most underfunded schools also serve 64% of Pennsylvania's English language learners and 35% of Pennsylvania's students with disabilities. Obviously, those statistics are staggering. 20% of our districts serve nearly 60% of students in poverty. I was hoping that we could connect the dots with the 2 points of your testimony, that spending increases help low-income students and that smaller class sizes make a difference, which I agree. Given what you heard about how many of our low-income and high-need students are concentrated in underfunded districts, aren't there additional factors that would go into how much it costs the district to lower its class size? For example, if you have 2 schools with equal poverty rates, but one has overflowing old facilities, students that need one-on-one paraprofessionals, more students that are English language in ESL, wouldn't it cost that district more to lower the class size and improve education outcomes than the district with ample room that could simply just hire additional teachers?
Are you asking about the impact of the facility conditions in a school as the big contraster, or is it something?
I mean, that's one of them. I'm trying to ask, like, that assuming that the poverty rates are equal, aren't there other things that would make it cost more to improve education outcomes between students? I can repeat my question if that helps.
What was that?
I can repeat my question if that helps.
Yeah, if you could, that'd be super helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So given what you've heard about our low-income students and high-need students concentrated in underfunded districts, aren't there additional factors that go into how much it will cost a district to lower its class size? For example, if you have 2 schools with equal poverty rates, but one has overflowing old facilities, students with more that need more one-on-one supports like paraprofessionals, more students that are ESL, wouldn't it cost that district more to lower class size and improve education outcomes than a district with ample room that they only have to hire more teachers?
Yeah, I can definitely imagine different circumstances, and of course the weights are applied across an entire state typically, but then the formulas have other variables in other states. I mean, there could be a different weight for English learners. There's efforts to address facility issues in schools. And I know that something that we're really intrigued on is what Texas has done, which they actually are factoring in the neighborhood conditions in a school, to say that it's not just about whether you're low income, but how distressed is your neighborhood. And if your neighborhood is more distressed, we're going to increase the weight for you relative to a student who is low income, but they're living in a less distressed neighborhood. So that's something to kind of create additional factors.
So by distress, do you mean that they, their local property taxes can't support, additional revenue locally?
They looked in Texas, they look at the census blocks, and they say the education of the parents and the number of single families and just other variables about that neighborhood. It's not specific to the school in that neighborhood. It's about the conditions in that neighborhood that researchers have found to be highly predictive of educational outcomes. And that means that money, that associated money, can go with that student regardless of what school they're going to. If they transfer across the street, to the school across the street, that money still gets associated with them.
Are you aware of the weights that are in our formula?
I am only just generally aware. I mentioned the weight that's for low income. I'm aware of that and how it's a high weight, but because it's applied to a very low base, that's why it's producing a lower amount of money per low income student relative to other states.
We also have weights for English language learners. We have weights for local property tax impact, and 3 poverty indexes. So there's a lot that goes into our formula. So it would be helpful to understand when you're making suggestions to know where we're starting from. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Joseph, your testimony, it mentions success for all, whole school intervention model as an investment that leads to significant achievement gains. Could you provide us with an overview of what success for all programs are?
Sure, and I know this is just an example of something that's been heavily researched in terms of the outcomes and its costs, but it was developed by Johns Hopkins. It's all over the country, and it's an example of a whole school model where they reduce class size, they do the science of reading, they have tutoring. It's a package of interventions that are all individually evidence-based, and they've looked at the impact overall in those schools. And this is just a good example of a program that, for the investment, is producing a high return on investment. And I can definitely provide more information. There's a whole Success for All Foundation out there that is helping schools across the country implement that model.
That would be appreciated. Your testimony also discusses accountability measures and linking school performance to funding incentives. So can you outline some of those specific accountability measures that you believe should accompany new investments in education that have paid dividends in other states?
I really apologize. You froze there just for a second. So could you repeat the question for me?
Sure.
I'm sorry about that.
So your testimony discusses accountability measures and
Yes.
linking school performance to funding. So can you outline some of those specific accountability measures that you believe have shown to have been paid dividends when they've accompanied new investments in education?
I think that the Texas model that was developed, a few years ago, they call it college, career, and military readiness, is a great model, because linking the money to a single assessment or a student test is not as preferred as to what's the ultimate purpose of the K-12 system, which is to graduate students who are ready for college or career or military. So that's what Texas did. They basically said for every student who graduates college, career, military ready, the school district is getting an additional $3,000. And if that student is low income, it's $5,000. If that student is a student with disabilities, it's $7,000. And so that's where they're really seeing a kind of impact going upwards. The number of students who are succeeding is going upwards. The research on performance funding is all over the place. I mean, a lot of has been happening in higher education. I know that we have some material, which again I can follow up with, where they looked at the impact of performance funding for younger students, and they found out that there was a 23% increase in growth for the students who were in that program. And I think that for many policymakers, they're basically saying this is an intuitively obvious thing to us, that we need to have some of this money not just based about inputs. It has to be about something relating to outcomes, and to make sure that there's a higher return on investment.
So when you speak to these incentives, you look at the whole school. Are you talking about incentives for teachers or administrators, just schools?
Well, what happens in, for example, no, it could be, there's a variety of different ways, but in Texas, for every student in that graduating cohort that meets that standard, the money goes to the district or to the charter school, whoever's like, providing that service for the student.
Okay. Your testimony compares the impact on student performance that is realized from general funding increases as well as from strategic evidence-based investments. And you talk a little bit about class size, and you make the argument that schools can boost achievement more by making these strategic evidence-based investments rather than just a blanket general fund increase. And I think you were asked about this, but it would be really helpful, I think, if we could identify what some of those strategic evidence-based investments are, so that schools could be looking to implement those practices to maximize achievement gains, right? I think we all agree, and we're going to have points here where this commission may disagree, but I think that we all agree that we want to see the maximum return on investment of taxpayer dollars for these students. So help us identify what some of those strategic evidence-based investments are.
Yeah, and again, I can follow up with the commission about this. Because I think there's no one size fits all that we want to suggest that a state kind of push, but the reduced class size and the tutoring that is out there, the high dosage tutoring are great examples. The science of reading, there are investments, and I know that we've even like costed them out a little bit to kind of give a flavor, because they can cost in the thousands of dollars to implement. But that's definitely something I can follow up with you all to kind of give a better illustration of what some of those evidence-based investments are.
Thank you. I think that would be helpful. We've had a lot of conversations about what is adequate. And of course, we're always looking to boost student achievement. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the gentleman from Allentown, Representative Schweier, for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. Thank you for joining us, sir. The Pennsylvania Department of Education, and my friends to my physical left there know that I'm not always one to. I'm not known as the guy that blows a lot of sunshine around here. Does have a pretty remarkable resource for our public schools and I presume all of our schools, including our for-profit charters, our cybers, and our private schools. That is an entire resource on evidence-based programming, evidence-based curriculum, early intervention, all of the things that we've heard about through the last couple of years. I'm wondering, Mr. Jospeh, if you have ever taken a deep dive into what the Commonwealth already provides, what the recommendations are from our Department of Education as we look to create policies in addition to a funding formula. Have you ever taken a good look or a deep dive at any of that stuff?
No, I've not taken a look at that particular resource that you're mentioning.
Okay, I appreciate that, because it'd be interesting to know from your perspective how much of what we already doing matches what some of those other states that you're working on do, or the other research that you and your researchers have done. I basically would like to see a benchmark of what we already do in an otherwise underfunded school system compares to those other states. So, okay. I want to switch topics a little bit. Explain to me, sir, why a school district a public school district, I'm not talking about a charter school, many of whom have their for-profit, arms. Explain to me, sir, why would a public school try harder, care more with a financial incentive if it kid passes some kind of, like, why, from your perspective, and I'm going to say I fundamentally reject this, but I'm open to a conversation about it. Why would a public school have a greater incentive to do what they're doing for their kids if they got an extra $3,000 graduation bonus? You talked about Texas getting multiple, having this perhaps innovative program that rewards school districts for having a certain outcome with a student with a financial reward. Why would a school district care? Like, why is that a reward for a school district?
Well, in Texas, it's hundreds of millions of dollars are going out to school districts.
Sure, we're talking about upwards of $6 billion of additional funding that we've heard from our researchers here in Pennsylvania. But, like, why is that an incentive structure for them? Like, isn't the incentive for most of our public educators to, like, I don't know, go to work and educate kids?
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. I think that the research is clear that even if it's 5 or 10% of the total dollars that are performance-based, it does drive school leaders and district leaders to want to change behavior because they have an ability to maximize their revenue, and they can use that money. It could be tens of millions of dollars in a district.
And you said, sir, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but let me get to another point. You said that this applies to any school, regardless of if it's a public charter, a private school, a religious-based school. Any of the any LEA would be eligible for this, correct?
I'm not sure I said that. I was just referring to what Texas and what Tennessee have done.
Okay, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. That's not my intention. I guess what safeguards, if we're going to start with a premise that I'm not sure that I agree with, that a school district is going to somehow be more interested in the outcome simply because they get a couple bucks and potentially thousands of dollars at the end of a year. It's not like those additional dollars. It's not a profit sharing with a company, right? It's not like a superintendent gets a bonus if any of this happens, right? So, or a teacher or anybody else. So, if those dollars aren't translating, what is incentivizing a, say, charter school from cherry picking kids that they are pretty confident are going to be able to achieve those outcomes, and just leave the lower performing or underinvested public school in the lurch, getting less money? It seems like a perverse incentive is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I know that this is a concern that people have raised. I think what Texas and Tennessee have both done, these are the states that have most recently done this, is that to address some of the equity concerns, they provide substantially higher rewards for success with the higher need students. It could be double, so even if half the number of those students are succeeding, that school is still getting the same amount of money because they're getting double the amount of money for those students. And I know that I interviewed some of the superintendents in Texas, and I can just tell you, they absolutely said that this has been transformational in their districts because there's a substantial amount of money available. They are seeing that there's an opportunity to improve their success. They're getting help from nonprofits. They're helping them even understand what are the strategies they can use to improve the number of graduates who are college and career ready, and it is having an impact. And then because of the money being double for the higher need students, we don't see the equity issues. There is not an incentive to cream students because you can take a more disadvantaged students and succeed and get double the resources. The other thing I just want to say is that performance funding is just on top of the weighted student dollars that I mentioned earlier in my testimony. That is that the base core resources are still higher for low-income students in Texas and Tennessee, independent of the performance funding. So they are getting the resources, the base resources they need, including supplemental dollars for their higher need students that help them kind of address that core need. And then on top of that, they're getting the performance.
Okay, that's an important delineation, and I appreciate that clarification because I no surprise, I fundamentally believe that we have to be investing more based on those things, and we should have a formula that reflects it. So, all right, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Isaacson. Okay.
Thank you and good morning. It's been fascinating listening to this testimony and the questions and answers that have been going forth. And I appreciate that you are basing a lot of this on Texas and Tennessee. Here in Pennsylvania, we have quite the diverse amount of school districts, and they're numerous, as we're here in a more rural area. I am from Philadelphia, the largest urban area, and in my school district, we have blue ribbon schools. We have some of the highest performing achieving schools in the state, and we have some of the lowest. And one of the things that this performance-based success to funding discussion that I've been listening to I haven't heard anything about taking into account the lowest performing schools and the highest performing schools being in a school district together, as well as something that the courts brought up that we are tasked with, and we have discussed it in every hearing that we have had as we're trying to come up with this new formula. And I look forward to hearing from the school districts that are going to testify today about what challenges they have. But that's with regard to the facilities. And, here in Pennsylvania, not everywhere can you build a brand new facility. I know certainly in my area, as well as some other areas across the Commonwealth, the school buildings have asbestos. They have lead in their water, not just from the paint on the ceilings, but in their actual water. And if there's major infrastructure issues, and obviously those are things that we are going to have to help our school districts deal with, because it certainly was an issue that the court took up with us. How does that work into the performance-based funding?
I wonder whether maybe you could clarify, how does performance funding work for a school that's having facility challenges, or the relationship between those two?
Yes, well, obviously there's a relationship between them. Children who are sitting there in buildings that are overheated or freezing with asbestos and lead paint, obviously, going around, are not going to be able to have the same quality of education with regard to the atmosphere in which we try and educate our children and make them feel wanted and loved, and how much we value their education. So, as I said, I haven't heard you deal with the issue of the environment in which we're educating our kids. The only aspect you keep bringing up is the class size. So, obviously, you recognize that atmosphere by a class size is something that is important to educating the children. And so I just wanted to know, since you're bringing up Texas and Tennessee, do they have the same challenges we have here in Pennsylvania, which was certainly a major part of the court case that we're trying to address with regard to educating our children here in Pennsylvania?
Right. I mean, again, the performance funding is intended to be on top of everything else. I mean, it's that 5 or 10% that does have a major impact, but it's not supposed to be the entirety of the policies. I mean, the diagnostic tool that we have has like 15 or 20 different policies in it. And certainly, facilities are an important part of that. And in fact, Dr. Jackson, one of the researchers that I mentioned, looked specifically at what's the impact of an investment for capital, and found similarly to investments on the operating side that the research kind of holds that it does produce an impact, double for the low income students, but that the range is so high that you still have to look at these other policies to make sure the other policies are in place to produce the maximum impact of whatever investment, whether it's new money or existing money. It really is the state policies that drive whether you're going to be at that average, which is quite small for $1,000. It's a small impact, or 5 or 10 times that amount. If you get to the 5 or 10 times amount, that's when you're talking about students really changing dramatically in achievement and achievement gaps being narrowed substantially. So I think it's really a combination of these things, some of which are funding specific and some of them aren't, that a state needs to really think about when it's doing investments. It's not just the investment side, but the other policies that help improve the outcomes much higher than just that general flow of dollars into schools.
Okay, for the caution of time, I will end my questioning there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank the gentlelady from Philadelphia and recognize Representative Warner for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in your testimony here, there's some discussion about student-centered funding formula. And of note in here, you have that Pennsylvania sends only about 25% of its K through 12 funding through a student-weighted formula. One, can you talk about your knowledge of where other states are in comparison to this? Is Pennsylvania, is this extremely on the low end? Is this in the middle, the high end? And if you can, if you have any outcomes of other states that may have different levels of the student-based, of the student-centered funding formula.
Yeah, it's really all over the place. I know that like in Florida, you would see like 80 to 90% of the money that's going through the core student-centered funding formula. There's a few states in this country that don't even have a student-centered funding formula. They're going to be close to the 0%. But in most states that have a student-centered funding formula, it's going to be more than 50%, as high as 80 to 90% of the money is going through the funding form, that core student-centered funding formula.
I mean, and so can you correlate outcomes to that at all, as student outcomes?
I think where you can correlate it is to the transparency and the flexibility and the clarity through which the leaders who are closest to the students have the ability to make the investments they think is most appropriate. That's where they see the kind of higher impact. And they have done studies where the formula is so complicated and there's 36 different versions. California had this, where the principals had no clue on where they're getting the money from, and they had so many rules and restrictions on it that you just felt like they just can't look at the entirety of their resources and figure out, how do I pull it together to the benefit of my students?
Thank you, Representative. We'll say this, Mr. Joseph, we appreciate your testimony very much here today and look forward to receiving those materials that you have offered in follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Our next testifier today is the head of the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools, Mr. David Burkett. He is the superintendent of Everett Area School District. And we welcome him here today in person. And if you could, please raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And if so, please indicate by saying, I do. Thank you very much. Please proceed with your testimony when you are ready.
Ladies and gentlemen of the PA Basic Education Funding Commission, I thank you for the opportunity to address this crucial issue today. My name is David Burkett, and I am Superintendent of Everett Area School District located in Bedford County, and that's actually in Representative Topper's district. Since 2015, I have served on the Executive Board of Pennsylvania Association of Rural Small Schools, better known as PARSS. This past April, I was appointed as the PARSS Secretary, and I stand before you to emphasize the pressing need for fair and equitable funding for public education in Pennsylvania. I'd like to pause there, and I'd be remiss if I wouldn't thank Representative Schreier and also Representative Topper publicly for coming to the PARSS convention and addressing the superintendents at the PARSS convention. Our state's future depends on the quality education we provide to our children. It is our fiduciary responsibility to ensure that every student has equal access to opportunities that education affords. Since I am a history teacher or educator, I would like to share a very brief history of PARSS. Since 1983, it has remained the mission of PARSS to advocate and promote equal opportunity for quality education for all students in every school and community in Pennsylvania. And that's actually part of the PARSS mission statement. In the early 1980s, a new funding formula was created called the Equalized Subsidy for Basic Education, ESBE formula. Even then, the state did not fully fund the ESBE formula and only funded it at 80%. As tend to always be the case, this meant poor school districts lost funding proportionally to wealthier school districts due to low aid ratios. Because of this inequity, PARSS filed the first equity lawsuit against PA Governor Robert Casey in 1991 on behalf of its collective membership of 214 school districts. And the membership dues back then was only $1 for each school district to be a member. It has gone up since then. But in 1999, a decision was handed down on the first lawsuit by the Commonwealth Court of Pennsylvania that stated equitable funding for school district was not a non-judiciable issue. Even so, PARSS continued to carry the torch for fair and equitable funding, school funding. By November of 2014, PARSS, as a lone educational organization with 6 school districts, 7 parents, and the NAACP, organized as plaintiffs and filed a second PA school funding lawsuit. After almost a decade of oral arguments, legal motions, briefs, and continuances, a landmark decision was handed down on February the 7th, 2023, by Honorable President Judge Renee Cohen Jubileer, stating, "It is now the obligation of the legislature, the executive branch, and educators to make the constitutional promise of a thorough and efficient education system a reality in this Commonwealth." For over 40 years, the genuine focus of PARSS and fair public school funding has been inseparable. Fair funding is what birthed the PARSS organization, and we are vested in the continual call for fair and equitable funding. Allocating the same dollar amount per student to every school district, regardless of their zip code, only exacerbates the recurring inequity. According to data by Penn State University's Dr. Matthew Kelly, 172 PARSS school districts are underfunded at least $1,000 per student, and 115 PARSS school districts have inadequacy of at least $3,000 per student. This is proof that within just the PARSS membership schools, there is inequity of funding received. As an organization, PARSS is delivering a consistent message to the legislature and advocating for the following. 1, create serious adequacy targets for what schools need in order to provide students with a comprehensive, effective, and contemporary education. Regardless of students' need or zip code, please provide them with resources to succeed in life and meet these goals. Number 2, develop a fair and equitable allocation of the state share to attain these goals so that each school district, along with the reasonable local tax efforts, can maintain adequate school funding, representing low-wealth schools. PARSS knows all too well our districts cannot tax their way to sufficient funding. We're unable to. This is the state's responsibility. There is an overdue need to address funding for special education, pre-kindergarten programs, and also outdated facilities. Judge Jubileer's opinion clearly stated the Constitution requires adequate funding for all aspects of public education, including early childhood education, special needs students, and school facilities. All these educational system funding components must be addressed. Now is the time. We can't wait another 40 years. That's 3 cycles of kindergarten through 12th grade students going through the system. This is not a problem to be kicked down the road. There must be a sense of urgency to fix the problem of unfair, and inequitable funding of public schools. We all need to work together to create a clear vision for the future of our children and rebuild the PA public education system. Without a vision, the people will perish. As superintendent of PARSS School District, the Everett Area School District, like many others, face significant challenges due to inequitable funding. Despite our commitment to providing a quality education as a rural school district, the Everett Area School District has grappled with limited resources, outdated textbooks, and inadequate infrastructure. Understandably, these disparities are not unique just to Everett Area School District, and similar stories are echoed across our state. These disparities were shared in my written testimony. Our public education system is the cornerstone of our society, shaping the future of our children and the prosperities of our communities. It is a fundamental tenet of democracy that every child, regardless of their background or zip code, should have access to a high-quality education. However, the current state of education funding in Pennsylvania falls short of this ideal, especially for rural school districts. I implore you to consider the urgency of rectifying this situation. In conclusion, we cannot ignore the harsh realities faced by districts like Everett Area, nor can we overlook the invaluable contributions of rural education in our state's prosperity. It is our moral duty and it is economically imperative that these funding disparities be rectified to provide every child in Pennsylvania an excellent and equitable education. We cannot let another generation of children pass by until we get this right. The future of our society and this state depends upon it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burkett. Representative Sturla for question.
Thank you. Your testimony, you pointed out the old ESPY formula, and I'm one of those guys that was around long enough to remember trying to wade through that. But it was interesting because oftentimes we talk about when the cuts were made of $1 billion and how it adversely impacted poorer districts in particular, because it was a 10% cut across the board and they were getting a larger share from the state. You point out that inadequately funded school districts, which was the case with ESPY when there was only getting 80%, hurt poorer districts also. And I just did a little back of the page calculation here. You know, a poorer district that's getting 80% of their funding from the state and has 20% local share, when they're cut by 80% from the when they only get 80% funding from the state, they end up with 64% from the state. They're 24 or 20% locals. They're at 84% funding. A wealthier district, which has 20% coming from the state and 80% in local, they get cut 80%. They're down to 16% state and 80% local. They're at 96%. I mean, it's just a 12% difference in their total funding. I mean, on the whole, PARSS districts are poorer districts, correct?
On the whole, yes, they are. Yeah, it's rural, small school districts throughout the state. It's not the urban school districts like Representative Isaksen's school districts in Philadelphia. But because of that, similar to our school district at Everett, right now we fund about 48% on an average year of the local tax base. 50% comes from the state.
Okay.
You know, so, and that's under the current funding formula. We have a large portion right now of the ESSER funds that are in our budget right now, but that all dries up come September the 30th, 2024.
Yeah.
You know, so we're looking at, you know, probably about a shortfall of about $1 million that we have to compensate for and figure out a way how to do that. And unfortunately, sometimes it is fewer teachers.
Yeah, yeah. And to Philadelphia, $1 million doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a large percentage of your budget. That's the, you know.
Especially when you have a budget less than $24 million.
Yeah. So as a follow-up, we put a factor in for sparsity. And that's supposed to cover the fact that gosh, you got longer bus runs, you got, you still need a business manager, even though your school doesn't have, as many students, and you need, there's still some fixed costs in terms of doing that. One of the issues that I've been particularly concerned about is poverty, and we have a factor for poverty. And the question is, do your kids actually get counted in those poverty counts? And because of the way we calculate it, I mean, sometimes it's census tracts, sometimes it's other things. And what I've always talked about was concentrated poverty, where there's kids, and the previous testifier talked a little bit about kids that are in concentrated poverty. They go home after school and they don't have any friend to go to that's got a shelf full of books, or the parents have master's degrees or things like that. The poverty is concentrated, and that's their life other than when they're at school. The same I've always said is true of what I call isolated poverty. The kid that gets off the bus, walks down a lane to a trailer, and has to walk 3 miles or 5 miles to get to the nearest friend who probably doesn't have books either. And that's just as devastating to that kid in terms of no access to internet, no access to books, no access to. Does the rural factor, the sparsity factor, is that enough to compensate you for those kids that obviously their only avenue for learning is the time you have them in school?
There are things that the legislatures have done to help with that, and I commend the legislature and Governor Shapiro for granting free breakfasts for every student in Pennsylvania. That should be, in my opinion, it should be free breakfast and lunch for every student in Pennsylvania, because the children can't control the parents. Right. We have to focus on the children. And back to the point about educators, and I heard this in the last testimony and one of the questions, I truly believe 99.9% of all educators in the state have an intrinsic value of being in education. They're there because they truly love and care for kids in our state. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize that while the testimony was being taken, we have been joined by Senator Argyle as well as Senator Hughes. Now turn to Senator Miller for a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Superintendent, for your testimony. One thing in your written testimony was your extracurricular activities. You mentioned Representative Schweier and I represent the Allentown School District that a number of years ago cut programs such as art and music. And I think about when a student applies for college and colleges look at a well-rounded students, we're not giving the students the opportunity to be well-rounded, and not just for college, but for careers and post-graduation. Just could you talk a little bit about how that impacts student outcomes?
Well, there's things that are learned in extracurricular activities that are not just based learned in the regular ed classroom. And it's commitment, it's time that you put into it. And that's why colleges look at that. How committed are you beyond just your regular education classrooms, your advanced placement courses? And they look at that favorably whenever they're looking to enroll students. I had the privilege of not just being the superintendent of Everett Area School District, I was also the superintendent of Fayette Middle School District previously. Prior to me being the superintendent of Fayette Middle School District in 2011, after the cuts that were made by Governor Corbett then, and all the federal funds got taken out of the acting budget, the school district down there, in order to survive, eliminated all junior high sports. And it was that way for at least a year, and then a community organization put together funding to bring back junior high sports, paying for their uniforms, paying for the bus transportation, paying for the coaches, and they still do that to this day. Fayette Middle School District is one of the 8th smallest school districts in the state, and that's what's happening in our state right now. And why is that important? Well, because it's proven that attendance rates are up for students that are involved in extracurricular activities. their academics are better because they need to have better academics in order to participate. So it does create a well-rounded student.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Schweier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of just kind of cleanup questions, if I could. And Chair Sturla got to the sparsity question, which I really wanted to drill down on. It's already a factor in the traditional BEF. It's something that I think all of us are interested in seeing if there's a better way to address that, or at least a more robust way to address it. Transportation costs obviously impact your districts much more than many others. You have significant factors on getting bus drivers, all of those sorts of things. Yes. What happens when you're struggling with transportation?
We currently don't own our transportation. We outsource our transportation to
Sure.
contractors.
Sure.
The biggest issue right now is finding drivers. And granted, the PennDOT has relinquished some of the requirements so that we can get some bus drivers with some of the checks that they have to do if they want to be a driver. But it's one of those things where we work with our contractor in order to better accommodate and also save money for the school district and save money for the contractor to not have to get another driver. We have eliminated some routes. So you try to eliminate some routes to put more students on a bus, try to get it maxed out on the size of the bus that they are. We actually, one bus contractor actually purchased 84 passenger buses so that he could eliminate some bus routes because he can't find drivers.
Right. And it is legal for public transit systems to directly compete with those. I just putting on my old public transit hat. So the school districts that use public transit, you don't have a very robust public transit in Bedford County, but
No, we don't have that.
But Washington County, just right next door, has like 7 or 8 transit systems. So there are rural areas that have more robust mass transit. Okay. I want to promise my colleagues I'm not trying to set up any kind of gotcha questions. I promise you all that. How many of your PARSS schools are level up districts, roughly?
Not exactly sure how many. I think it's close around 100.
Okay.
Yeah.
I figured it was probably in the 80s or 90s. Okay. There's a reason why I'm asking that question. Well, that'll be a conversation.
We currently are not, but back in 2021.
You were one of those ones that...
We were one,
Right.
but because we were on the brink,
Right.
we ended up not being one of the ones.
Understood. Okay, thank you. Moving off that subject and moving down to the next one. For PARSS schools, the question about charter schools, because we've had this conversation when I visited your organization, in places like mine, and I would argue probably Mary's district and maybe even Mike's, we have a higher number, or at least higher expenditures for the bricks and mortar versus cyber. I'm imagining that's completely opposite for most PARSS districts.
In our locale, I think there's one charter school that draws students to it that is a brick and mortar. For the vast majority, it is cyber charter schools. Personally, I would like to see legislation to break out those two and separate them as two separate entities in funding and have brick and mortar charter schools.
I imagine most PARSS schools would say that, so yeah.
Because last year we had right around, out of population, a little over 1,200 students, we had 47 students in cyber charter schools.
Versus how many in bricks and mortar?
I'm not sure how many were in the brick and mortar, but in the total cyber charter schools, there were 47 of those.
And that's not one that's run by you or your IU,
No,
correct?
no, it isn't.
Okay,
No.
all right.
And out of that, the dollar figure that also comes from our school district general fund is
Sure.
Close to $700,000,
It's a pretty sizable percentage of your budget.
especially when $325,000 of that is for special ed.
Right. Thank you, sir. That's all I got, ma'am.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Isaacson for question.
Hi, how you doing? I actually have very much enjoyed being on this commission and getting to know all the different districts here around the Commonwealth. And I find it the most fascinating here, the rural and the most urban have so much in common. And we do need to make sure that you're the children in your school districts are taken care of, just as the children in my school districts need to be taken care of. And I appreciate you bringing up the facilities. I'm not going to harp on it because there was something else I want to touch upon. But I did notice in your testimony, you brought up just maintaining HVAC, like just the basic maintenance. We're not even talking new construction.
No.
It's a huge issue all around this Commonwealth, and something hopefully we can take up. But something also that we have in common, I know my school district board brought up to me when I got appointed to this, the technology issues that all school districts are now grappling with as an additional cost, even since the last formula was brought about, I believe, 7 or 8 years ago, especially after the pandemic, connectivity, investments in technology, but not only just the investments of the initial, like building a new building, but the maintenance of the technology, including having to have somebody to have another employee or someone to be maintaining the technology and keeping it up to date. Could you talk a little bit how you grapple with that in the rural school district? Because what I just described was what was brought to me by my school board about issues that in a large urban district, keeping everybody connected, modern technology and the maintenance and the troubleshooting has become an additional continual cost going in the future that wasn't anticipated previously.
With COVID and everything that we had to endure with that, it has forced just about every school district in the state to go to about 1-on-1. And we are 1-to-1 in devices. Every student has a device, which is nice when they're on campus. And we do employ a IT person, and his sole responsibility. He is a rock star. I tell him every day he is a rock star because he just keeps everything running. And when Kevin goes out and he works on things, you know, he makes sure it's running there on campus. But we have students that live in rural areas. We are the largest geographical school district in Bedford County. And we go down to the Maryland line, and we go down into Artemis and in various regions throughout the rural area of the school district. Granted, we have a town, 2 towns that we service, but when you get into those rural areas, it's either the parents can't afford internet connectivity or they just don't have internet connectivity because we live in the Appalachia, in the Ridge and Valley region of the state, and because of that, you know, it's hard to get good signals bouncing off of mountains and, you know, the connectivity.
I live in the most urban area, and we have connectivity problems because of affordability, et cetera.
Yeah.
And that's where I started out, that all these issues, and I really appreciate your testimony, it's very similar to what we face in the urban area, and it's important that we address it all around. So thank you, and I look forward to coming to Bedford County.
You're more than welcome, and I'll give you a tour of our schools.
We will look forward to taking you up on that at some point, hopefully. So we are, first off, again, thank you for being here. Your testimony today in talking about fully implementing the fair funding formula, when you make that statement, to me that means driving all of the basic education funding dollars through that formula that was created in 2015 with no hold harmless provision. Are we on the same page when you make that statement? Is that what you are indicating?
No, I am not.
Okay. So when you
you
say the fair funding formula, define that for me.
When I'm making that statement on the fair funding formula, that's what the commission is tasked with. Just like the SB used to be the funding formula, and just like the 2015 was the funding formula, you guys have an awesome responsibility coming up with the perfect formula. It will no longer be the 2015 formula. So with that new formula, it needs to make sure that it is adequate, that there is no inequity among the school districts and students.
So when you make that statement, you are just making a blanket statement that whatever we create needs to be a fair funding formula and all the money should drive through it. We should eliminate hold harmless.
I'm not advocating for eliminating hold harmless, because I will tell you that it has been a benefit for rural school districts. And it has, because of the
Okay.
declining population in rural school districts.
Okay. All right. So that was not clear from your testimony. What I did is I had our appropriations staff run your numbers, because when that was written in your testimony, what that indicated to me was that 2015 formula has been blanketed out there as the fair funding formula. And if that was in fact the case, when we ran all of Everett's, when we ran all of that, Everett would lose a couple $100,000, because that, implementing the fair funding formula that everyone is bantering about, means that there is an elimination of everything that happened prior to 2015. All the money goes into that new formula forward through that. So I'm concerned that your testimony that you provided here today doesn't accurately capture that. I also ran all of Bedford County's school district through the 2015 formula, and your county as a whole would lose about $15 million. So what you're testifying to here today, define what you believe to be a fair funding formula for Everett and for PARSS schools.
For Everett and PARSS schools, I think that it has to be equitable. And
So that's a great term.
It is.
It's really nebulous. What's equitable to me might not be equitable to you.
if you've never seen this picture, that's equitable.
I completely understand that. But we have to make a definition of what that is. This committee is tasked with that. And so your testimony, if we took it on face value, if I didn't ask you this question, we would have left here believing that you think all that money should run through that 2015 formula. You need to be, for you to be really helpful, and this testimony that you're providing here today, we need to understand what it is you believe would create a formula that would equitably drive out basic education funding dollars. What are the key components of that?
As far as the funding formula, again, I thank you for the clarification on that statement, because I was not intending that I wanted all the funds to go through the fair funding formula. That was not my intent. My intent was whatever the commission comes up with, because prior to 2015, there was a commission then that created that funding formula.
So the commission was established. It went in 2015. As a compromise, they kept the current funding system in place for all dollars up until that point, and then any new dollars that were added into basic education funding would be run through what was then known as the fair funding formula.
And that's where hold harmless came into play. And like I said, it's been a benefit.
And you're benefiting from hold harmless.
It's been a benefit to rural school districts.
So
because
you don't want
populations-
all the money to go through the fair funding
No,
formula?
I want a new formula
Okay.
that every student is adequately funded.
And what does that look like? We all want that, right? We're all sitting here, Democrats and Republicans. We all want that. But how we construct that formula, what factors we use, what we look at, how we weight things, that is what is going to make it equitable. But again, we can all have very different ideas of what gets us to equitable. And I think what I'm trying to drive out of, or drag out of you, or pull out of you, is what do you, as the superintendent of Everett Area School District and a representative of PARSS, believe that that looks like? And so, you know, that would be really helpful testimony.
When it comes to a dollar figure, I am a social studies guy. I'm not a dollar figure.
I'm not asking you for a dollar figure.
a
I'm asking
formula
you
figure.
for, okay, all right.
I'm at the position that I need to have enough funding so that I don't have to take my special ed teacher and have them do reading specialists instead of servicing students as a special ed teacher. And currently, that's what we do sometimes. We have to rob Peter to pay Paul in a rural school district to make sure that all of our components are being met and our children's needs are being met. And we don't have, like the luxury of a symphony orchestra like some school districts do.
I understand. I understand. Could you talk about your school infrastructure needs? We've heard a lot going across the Commonwealth about school infrastructure needs. Most of that testimony we have received from our urban districts, but my sense is that infrastructure needs exist in our small and our rural school districts as well. You talked a little bit about HVAC.
Yes.
Give us a better understanding of where our small and our rural school districts stand with these issues.
Probably the biggest issue in our school district right now is last Thursday evening, I held a Section 780 hearing. And a Section 780 hearing is to close the school building. Why are we closing the school building? Well, because it was built in 1958, and the roof needs repaired, and we had feasibility studies done in 2018, 2022. And the cost that it would take to bring that up to par as a building, we decided to restructure our building, move our 5th grade students into the middle school setting at the middle school high school that was renovated in 2011, and then pull all those students that are at that outlying building into the central building. That was built in 1979, and it's a newer building. And it has original HVAC to the building. It has univentilators that were installed when the building was built. So it has ceiling tiles that were installed that are sagging because of the moisture and the humidity in the rooms that need to be replaced. So we are currently looking as a facility committee on my board, how can we upgrade the HVAC in that building? I actually had Representative Topper walk through that building so that he could see the needs that we had. And I made the recommendation, it shouldn't fully rest on the back of our state taxpayers to help fund a new plan-con. School districts should also have some teeth in the game. And I truly think that, we should help contribute to paying for our facility infrastructure upgrades.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator Williams for a question.
Apologies. So as a petitioner in the lawsuit, you're saying that anything we do has to meet constitutional muster of adequacy and equitable. Is that correct?
Correct.
And Dr. Kelly was deemed an expert by the court, correct?
Correct.
The commission has received his recommendations, correct?
Yes.
And do you agree with, are you supportive of those recommendations?
I am supportive of recommending that we have adequacy funding for all. And I don't know his research
in detail. Okay.
in detail.
Okay, thank
But
you
I
very
do know
much.
what he said about just the PARSS school district. We have 172 that we're getting an adequacy of $1,000 and 115 an adequacy of $3,000 just within our organization.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Burkett, on a final note, was your school district or your organization a plaintiff in the case?
As a PARSS organization, as a school district in the PARSS organization, we were not one of the 6 that were part of. We are part of PARSS and have been part of PARSS for years, and the PARSS organization was one of the plaintiffs.
And did the PARSS organization contribute financially to any of the experts that provided information to make the case?
That I cannot answer because I do not know.
We'd appreciate it if you could let us know.
And
Thank
I
you
can get
very
back to you
much.
on that.
Thank you. Very good. Appreciate your testimony here today, and thank you for taking your time to come and be with us.
Thank you.
And with that, I would like to call up our next panel, consisting of Dr. Gary Peiffer, Superintendent of Chartiers Houston School District, Dr. Keith Hartbauer, Superintendent Brownsville Area School District, and Dr. Donald Martin, Executive Director of Intermediate Unit Number 1. And as you approach the table, gentlemen, if you could stand, raise your right hand so that we can swear you in, we would appreciate it. Thank you. Do you swear that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And if so, please indicate by saying, I do. I do. Thank you, gentlemen. And please, we will start with Dr. Peiffer, move to Dr. Hartbauer, and then finish with our IU, Dr. Martin. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, for affording us the opportunity. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, for affording us the opportunity to be here and participate in this very important topic before this committee. And I want to thank Representative Ortate for inviting me to come and be a part of this. Given the gravity of the funding situation, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak. And I think as superintendent, I provided a copy of my testimony for the committee. And I want to take a step back and really talk about the type of school that all of us as superintendents want to provide to our students. You know, ideally, we'd be able to provide a zero-sum budget and use that budget as our priority for academics, extracurricular activities, personnel, healthcare, and so forth. We know as superintendents we need to have a deadline in January to decide whether we're going to go above the index or below the index by Act 1. We know we have to have our preliminary budget by May, and we know we have to have it passed by June, so that by July 1st we are essentially in the new budget cycle. So when I look at Chartiers Houston is a small school district located in between the Camden-McMillan School District and Trinity. We're 25 square miles. We have 1,228 kids K through 12, only 2 buildings, 81 faculty members, 4 administrators at the building level, and 3 at the central office. So we're small, and it's nice that we get to know each other and work as professionals. But when I look at the school I want to provide and the education I want to provide for those students, one, it's got to be sustainable. It has to be competitive. It has to be rigorous. It has to provide equal opportunities for students to be able to get involved and to be able to grow. And it has to be inclusive, because we have to take all students and make them a part of the Chartiers Houston Buccaneer family. And I recognize that as a public school, we are an engine of commerce. We are an engine of civic responsibility. We're an engine of student development, because our end product as a 12th grader is going to be not only just a student in college, but it's going to be somebody's employee, is going to fuel the industry in technology, is going to provide work in manufacturing, in construction, in agriculture where we need jobs. So it's a regional position with a K through 12 system producing students who are going to be able to function in our economy, who are able to function as young adults, and who are going to become good citizens. And when we look at the budget and identify what our spending priorities are, that is what we as superintendents are tasked with. And we have to balance that with all the federal mandates, all the state mandates, all our local policies to do the best that we can do. The gentleman that I'm with today, I have the utmost respect for because of the work that they've done as educators, not only for their district, but also for our region. So in going over our figures, I want to stress what's difficult when we have to have a budget coming out and have to have everything approved and knowing where our line items are in June is going to be where that shifts. So, for example, we will soon start to put together our health insurance line item when we get what we anticipate the rates will be from the Allegheny County School Health Insurance Consortium in October. In the previous years, that health insurance increase has been around 3%. This last year, coming out of the wake of the pandemic, that jumped to 14%, which for us was $300,000 additional cost. We talk about personnel and salary steps. I provided a committee with the comparative chart of first steps and max steps at the doctorate level and the bachelor's level. Our district at Chartiers Houston is the lowest step in the county at $38,850 for step one. Now, we're not the lowest at the top of the scale because if somebody has a doctorate, they're getting $96,000. If somebody has a bachelor's degree, they're getting $94,000. But recruitment. Our program is only as good as the personnel we can recruit to teach it. And everybody here, I would venture to guess, whether you're Republican or Democrat, has one teacher or one coach that you connected with going through school. At least I hope so. That connectivity and personal input is ultimately what we want to provide for kids when they move forward, to give them that support. But I got to be able to recruit. We talk about at PASA the number of teachers coming out of the system at 6,000 as compared to, say, 20,000 that were coming out years ago. The drop in the pool of qualified candidates is alarming. I have a chemistry teacher who will probably retire in the next couple of years. I'm nervous about being able to recruit a chemistry teacher. I have a school nurse that's going to retire in a couple of years. I'm nervous about recruiting a school nurse. With our salary as it currently is, and again, I'm only in my third year at Chartiers Houston. The salary and the contract was negotiated prior to my arrival. But I can tell you this summer we hired several new teachers who then left us before the summer was out to go to higher paying districts. That directly affects the quality of instruction we can provide, and it affects our continuity. And as you know, with adolescents and young children, they need that continuity. So when I look at the fair funding formula discussions, to me, it's really a discussion not just of providing what is needed for students to succeed, it's also a discussion of shifting the tax burden from the local taxpayer. I'm at Chartiers Houston now, but prior I'd been at Greensburg-Salem for 3 years. I'd been at Carlington for 6 years in Allegheny County, and I taught outside of Philadelphia at an approved private school called Carson Valley. And I can tell you from that whole range of adjudicated youth coming from inner city projects like Richard Allen and Mill Creek in West Philly, all the way to students coming in to classes from $400,000 homes where dad's a lawyer and mom's a doctor. And we seek to provide opportunities for all those students. And it comes back to my tax base. If I don't have a tax base that can support growth, that can support addition of new technology. So case in point, when the pandemic came out, Chartiers Houston, and we did at Greensburg-Salem, and I venture everybody here did, move to a one-to-one initiative. Now that, if you remember back in the Rendell era, when they had Classrooms for the Future, there had been discussion about a one-to-one student-to-technology initiative in 2000, in 2001, and districts never did it because it was too expensive. Now with the pandemic and having to go to hybrid classes, we had no choice to educate students through hybrid learning and providing a one-to-one initiative for students. But in a rural area, often that connectivity with the internet is lacking, and we would have to provide extra equipment to help students connect, and that's a cost and a burden. Money that was used with ESSER funds to buy devices for students to educate them now has to be supplemented with money coming from the BEF for the district. We just put out $137,000, for example, at Chartiers Houston for new teacher devices and student devices. We also have budgeted $30,000 for ongoing services and another $50,000 with CCL ProTech, and that's still not enough. So that's an example of the factors of reality coming to a small district like ours is, and even though we're not as financially burdened as, say, a Wilkinsburg or Duquesne City, but we still have to have those programs to be competitive. We still have to provide so many advanced placement courses to be competitive, because we don't get ranked on how many students passed the NOCTI, how many students got an adequate job in technology and work after graduation. Schools get measured by how many advanced placement courses, how many kids went to a 4-year school, which I would argue is unfair and not reflective of the types of job creations we're trying to do. But staying competitive means staying competitive with other districts to draw your student population to. In Western Pennsylvania in particular, you know we have an aging population. You know a lot of the homes were built after World War II, Little Cape Cods. Those seniors who make up a large part of our community and several of our communities can't sustain ongoing local tax increases. The fair funding formula to me is an opportunity to shift that tax burden back to the state, which used to carry more of it, so that we can remain competitive, so we can train students for the next economy. When I have a new teacher, I talk with them not necessarily about how are we assessing students and tell me your lesson plan of the day, although we do talk about that. But I want them to think in the bigger picture. If I have a teacher coming in that's 22 out of the University of Pittsburgh, I start telling them, think about what your education program in our class and our school is going to look like when you retire 30 years from now. What's it going to be like at mid-century? We need to lay the foundation now for doing that, and I think that's one of the things the fair funding formula does. So we have always had a deficit with the money that the state provides and the money that comes that the school has to absorb after the budget's passed due to changing conditions. Whether it's an increase in students, we had an increase of 53 students from last year and more. Whether it's an unanticipated catastrophe like the COVID-19 pandemic, we have to make up for that. And if it's a grant that we're bringing in, we have to sustain it, and we have to absorb that cost eventually. So the opportunity for me in going over our enrollments and the data, and I have information there about personnel costs, because that's always our biggest cost, and how we've exceeded, because we're trying to bring people in, and any discussion that the legislator has on a larger scale, say about raising minimum wage, that sounds great, but people have to understand, for school districts, we're going to have to adjust that in all of our units in addition to our teachers, which would be our custodians, which would be our cafeteria help, which would be our bus drivers. There's a ripple effect. There's a change effect from the 1st of July to the time we come in. If I get new ESL students, I'm going to make up for that cost out of existing revenue we budgeted. If, you know, we have a situation right now at Chartiers Houston with facilities, and we've all talked about facilities. That school was built over old mine runoff. So we have a spring. So if you come, and I'd invite the committee to come see a Chartiers Houston football game, you'll see on the hillside where it's bubbling out. And the hill itself is beginning to slough off. Well, why? Well, because there's an underground spring for mine water, and we had to pay $10,000 to have an engineer come out and do soil samples. But I guarantee you that's going to come into our eventual budget, where we're going to have to do something about it, because it's a safety and it's a liability. So when we look at where's that money going to come from, and I'm going to segue here a little bit to fund balance. You know, we have approximately $23 million that we have in revenue from our district. We have $25 million in expenditure, and we have an $8 million fund balance that was built up. But that fund balance is going towards capital projects. So, you know, we have to repave the parking lot. We did roof work. We have to do lighting work. Anytime you have the state police come out and do an RVAT, risk vulnerability assessment, there's recommendations on how to improve safety in school with physical grounds that extend beyond a grant. And we make up for that to provide for safety and security, and these facilities come into that. So even though we have a fund balance, that's really going towards our capital projects. So if it's difficult for us at Chartiers Houston, it is that much more difficult for a Philadelphia school district or for a Turkey Foot or anywhere across the spectrum where there's not a large, wealthy tax base to absorb and provide these things. So for me, I think the discussion is a lot about shifting the tax burden from the local population back to the state, and then looking at ways to try to build as much as possible a zero-sum budget with leaving a cushion for accountability for those items that come up, like additional services. I apologize if I exceeded my limit, but
we appreciate
I want to thank
your
you.
passion in your testimony, and welcome Dr. Hartbauer to testify as well.
Thank you to the committee and to Representative Warner for having us here today, to my colleagues who are behind us that could very easily be up here testifying about the same things as well. I'm going to take a little bit different approach to this testimony today, and I think that changed when I heard Representative Sturla speak earlier, that he wants to hear things that are not preconceived ideas. I'm going to start out with a story. When I first started 7 years ago at Brownsville, I had all these great ideas how we're going to improve student achievement and do all these types of things that we're going to do. In the spring, when the standardized testing came out and I was walking through the elementary school, I saw an elementary teacher crying, or a counselor crying, and I said, "What's wrong?" She said, and for the sake of just making up a name, I was with Mary, and Mary just told me about last night when they sneak out at night because they don't have running water in their house, and they take the water from the spigot of the outside house of their neighbor just so that they can wash their clothes and cook their meals and do things like that. My whole perception of education changed on that moment. How can we expect a child whose basic needs are not being met to succeed academically if they don't have shelter, food, water, and the things that they need to have? You've heard it before, I'm sure, Maslow before Bloom. Maslow, those hierarchy of needs. If we don't take care of those basic needs, it doesn't matter what we do, they're not going to move up that academic Bloom's taxonomy. So with that story in mind, and I'll circle back to that, Brownsville Area School District is a socioeconomically distressed area. There are no businesses. We are the last entity left in there. If we don't get Brownsville Elementary or school district where it needs to be, then that town will never have a chance to revive itself. We've spent painstaking time trying to connect our school with our community to try to revive the district, and I have some of the best educators within our school system as well. I have given you the testimony in front of you, so I'm not going to read this to you. I'm just going to kind of highlight some areas. Special education costs, we're 30% of our population is special education. The cost for providing quality special education services is significantly higher in a district like ours to hire the trained individuals, the therapists, and so forth that we need. The state funding formula does not really adequately help us in this situation. An example I gave you at the bottom was last year when I asked my business manager to pull these numbers. We spent about $6.5 million on special education and only received 1.7 back. Charter schools and cyber schools, I'll lump those together, and they all have their value, and I'm not here to detract from that. I'm just asking that we look at it from a fair and equitable. I know we use the word equitable again, and what I'm talking about is equitable and the procedures, policies, practices are the same across the board. The accountability, the transparency that we have from public schools, what we are doing in public schools, and sometimes we take a bad rap when we're comparing apples to oranges when things come out in the public. The checks and balances, I guess, is what I'm looking for from the equitable standpoint. About close to $2 million we spent on those costs that could be coming back towards our kids in regular education. The outside cyber costs, they start out, we have our kids will go to an outside cyber, regular ed student will go to an outside cyber, and it costs us about $10,000. About 6 weeks to a few months later, we get a notification that that child has been tested and now needs speech or needs some type of special education. Now that special education cost goes to $30,000. So when you're talking about 100 students that are placed outside, that's a huge burden that comes back onto our local district and to our taxpayers. the rural schools and the funding disparities that we have, that we struggle with declining enrollments. When I started, we were a little over 1,600. Now we're a little bit below 1,500. And again, I should have started with this before. I sit before you as the superintendent of Brownsville Area School District, but on my shoulders are 1,500 students, 100 teachers, and families of our community that are asking you to hear and listen from your heart today, and I ask that you do so. The state funding formula doesn't really adequately address the unique challenges that sometimes we face as rural small districts. Allocating sufficient funds. I refer back to that study. Thank goodness we had the ESSER money that we were able to pump in over $1 million, over $200,000 a year to partner with a mental health agency to help some of the needs that we have. When we have a child that is going home and they find their guardian OD'd in their kitchen floor, or a parent who has attempted suicide, that comes back into our school. We are no longer a district that is just there for the math, the English, the reading, all those things. We're there also as the caregiver, and our students are there. The funding that we have for the lunches, the breakfast, and so forth, those are amazing. If we didn't have that, the kids in our district wouldn't have those opportunities to be fed like that. As a result of this, we have to make difficult decisions as we move forward as far as our programs, reducing our staff, increasing our class sizes, and so forth, how we do our scheduling. Everything is a painstaking, systems-oriented approach to what we're doing to make decisions that we can still fund that. Our basic education funding in Brownsville is about $14 million, which equals about maybe a little over $9,000 per student. As I stated before, we are an extremely distressed area, and as you all know, as the testimony today about where we rank as far as Pennsylvania in those areas, I guess I want to emphasize to you is that poverty is not a disability, okay? And we need to understand that, and we need to do things from that perspective so that we can get more on a level playing field. My personal children had an opportunity to come from one of the best academically achieving school districts in the state of Pennsylvania, all right? And the kids of Brownsville should have the opportunity to succeed at that same level, to have the same amount of resources that those children, that my own personal children had as well. I guess I really want to emphasize to you today that from our tax bases, our taxes really are only about 1/5 of what it costs to run our school district. We receive about a little over $5 million from our taxes of a budget of $30 million. What I'm trying to tell you today is public education is not broken, but the support for public education is. And we need to look at this from a different perspective, not necessarily I agree with what's going on in Texas and Tennessee, what we heard today, because my graduation rate in Brownsville is not going to change, and that's not going to increase my fundings because my basic needs need to be addressed first before I can have the high achievement of 90% graduation rate. So we need to look at it from a different perspective other than just an end result or an achievement result. I talked about Maslow and Bloom. I guess what we're looking for is the money to be allocated should be based on an equitable formula that includes socioeconomic status. Our states, and I'm going to end with this, our state's greatest resources are the young children that are in our public schools today. They are going to be our representatives. They're going to be our superintendents. They're going to be our teachers in the future. And every one of those children deserve the opportunities to succeed like any other child in rural or bigger districts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but certainly not least, Dr. Martin.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting us here, and I want to particularly thank Representatives Ortite and Warner for having us here. First of all, this is Intermediate Unit 1, and to explain a little about IU1, we oversee and work with 25 wonderful public school districts. We also have 5 career tech centers. We have 1 charter school that we just started not long ago, so we're not, in our region, we haven't had that experience, and we have a multitude of non-public and parochial schools. When you look at it, you're looking at roughly about 57,000 students and 5,500 to 6,000 educators. We cover a 3-county region, Fayette, Greene, and Washington counties. And by the way, where you're sitting today is one of the poorest counties out of the 67. And when you take a look at Greene County, that also ranks up in the top 10 of the poorest counties, and sometimes they were the number 1 and number 2, depending on the year. So this conversation is obviously very timely from an IU perspective. We do, obviously, you heard 2 superintendents this morning. From the lens of an executive director from an intermediate unit, I get to hear that quite often, and I get to speak with superintendents on a variety of issues. And really, when you think about this, in taking a look at the funding formula and the current funding formula, you have to take a look at the entire picture. You know, we heard from a policy expert this morning, and I respect that so much. But one of the things we talked about was in incentivizing things and providing those additional supports. I think he had also mentioned the figure of $1,000. When you take a look at $1,000 in IU1, that's very diverse. Because if we give schools an additional $1,000 per student, that money can be divided in a lot of different ways. And I can guarantee you that a lot of it may not be going directly to education. That money is going to facilities. That money's going to paying the bills. That money's going for cyber charter schools. That money, when you take a look at it, unfortunately, there's a whole bunch of things that are occurring before we get to that point of educating our students. And so you'll notice in my testimony, I didn't inundate you with a lot of statistics because those are there. And I'm sure you've heard these. When we heard this morning as we were discussing this, you know, a lot of times we say we're preaching to the choir because you know these things. You hear back in your home districts what's occurring. But, you know, one of the things we wanted to take a look at was in explaining IU1 a little further in terms of our demographics, we wanted to also take a look at some possible solutions, at least from my lens, or at least from our lens. And one of the things we do as an intermediate unit, there's 29 of them across the Commonwealth, as you're aware. We provide shared services to school districts. And I think that's something that we need to do. We're in this together. So, look, we can't go print more money. We can't just say we need more money. We have to be able to be held accountable as educators, and we have to be able to step up and say, what can we do? And one of those things, when you take a look at our districts, which many of them, 7 of them, by the way, are 1,000 students or less, according to the 21-22 data, and 11 of them have between 1 and 2,000 students. And when you take a look at where these districts are located, they could be, in some cases, between 6 and 10 miles apart. So what does that tell you? When you take a look at Fayette and Greene County and 6 school districts in Fayette and 5 in Greene County, these superintendents, regardless of having any mandates, they are being forced, and I really compliment them often, in Washington County as well, in their own pockets. They are taking the initiative and providing shared services without any mandate of doing so. So in terms of AP courses, in terms of career-based education, in terms of all these things that may be extra, instead of saying, look, we can't do it, and maybe crying about it, just being very, very honest, they're taking the initiative to say, let's take a look at the districts down the road and let's see how we can combine those services. Greene County is the same way. You know, some of those districts on paper, they may come across as the wealthiest school districts in terms of the minerals that are there. But when you take a look at really their tax bases, there really is none, or there's very little. And so those districts may look good on paper, but they're really not. But again, they take a look at those counties. They have taken the blueprint, and they have begun to work together, which I think is amazing. And they've saved taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars in doing so. And again, in pockets, 14 counties in Washington County, and Washington is a pretty large county, so you're not going to see all 14 of them working together, but you'll see pockets of 2, 3, 4 districts working together in terms of what I just had told you. So when you take a look at shared services, perhaps, just perhaps, there can be some sort of I don't want to say mandates, but there can be some sort of discussion over how districts can do that. And how do you incentivize those districts to do that? Because they are saving taxpayers money. So, and then one of the things that districts will tell you is, look, I want to do shared services, but transportation is 30% of my budget. Transportation costs are unbelievable. I think you had mentioned that, sir, before, because you have to transport students. We have districts that tell us all the time, we run center-based schools, and they say, look, we want to take advantage of your mental health programs. We can't get kids there. How bad is that? So when we talk about that, it's really, really important that we discuss those ancillary things outside of education, like the shared services and transportation. I talked about staffing in my testimony. I was very brief with that, but when you take a look at money that comes in per student, that's factored in a lot of different buckets, not just the education. But I'm not sure that we've taken a look at how, everyone talks about inequity. And I think someone had said, let's define inequity. When you take a look at inequity, you can have some of our districts that have elementary students, one teacher to 35 kids. It's not uncommon in IU1. And so how do we take a look, and I don't know the answer to this, but how do we take a look at this funding formula that's going to address a teacher to student ratio? Because I really think that's very important, especially when you're talking about rural schools that can't afford those additional teachers. I just wanted to bring up, someone had mentioned ESL. In IU1, a lot of people don't realize this, but we have two of the top schools in terms of ESL population here at IU1. The Cannon-McMillan School District and the Charleroi School District. And when you take a look at the overpopulation or the total population ratio to the number of ESL students, I believe Charleroi is number one in the state. I got a call from their superintendent not 2 weeks ago that said, look, I didn't factor this in my budget. And I have a budget this year, and I have a huge influx of ESL students that's going to exceed somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000 that I didn't account for. I need some help. When you take a look at the current formula, he may get that help, but it's over a 3-year rolling average that those students can leave prior to that. He needs help right now because they didn't factor that into the budget. So I just mentioned that because I think we need to also take a look at these things that occur that districts can't. These are things that you don't know when you're planning a budget that's going to occur. You don't know when a boiler isn't going to turn on either, which happens quite often with a lot of our schools that are that are kind of elderly and they've been used. Someone had mentioned the technology and the facilities, and I think I just hit on that. We did have to go to a one-to-one initiative. How do we continue to do that? How do we continue to do that equitably? And finally, I'm not sure this has much to do with the discussion of fair funding, but I did have to tell you in terms of the accountability, I think you, sir, had talked about test scores and with the first speaker, and how do you incentivize and reward for higher test scores. When you take a look at this, every one of us as educators, what we've all been, what's really drilled in our heads is we produce lifelong learners. That's what we're to do in society. And so have we ever taken a look at, are we doing that? Instead of a third grade, not that it's not important, but instead of taking a look and analyzing a third grader's PSSA score and telling a district that you're not performing, why don't we take a look at people who have graduated from our programs and the success that they've had? Because really, that's what we're to do, is produce lifelong learners. So if we're going to attach any accountability, I think it has to go on that end as well. And with that, I will wrap up. And thank you very much again for having us.
Thank you so much. Representative Sturla for question.
Thanks. I got, actually a couple questions, but Dr. Peiffer, you talked about reserve fund balances, and that's been a topic that some people have said, gee, school districts should just get rid of all their fund balances because that way we would put that money into education. And but we as a state have a $5 billion rainy day fund balance because we say it's important to make sure that we have something to smooth some of those edges when they occur. You have no guarantee that we're going to fund you. I mean, this year, heck, we took away level up money, at least temporarily, and so you have to have your own fund balances to compensate for those things. I mean, in your opinion, is there is there a limit where we should say, gosh, okay, if you have a fund balance that exceeds your budget, maybe we say you can't have a fund balance that big. But at some point in time, given facilities needs and things like that, what's like the upper limit of where we should be saying we're going to cap you off there? You can't have a fund balance that exceeds a certain percentage of your budget or anything like that.
Well, I mean, there is a cap with the percentage that you can have for an unassigned fund balance versus an encumbered fund balance. You know, our fund balance at 8 million, we shifted a lot of that and encumbered that for capital projects that we knew were coming up. And we hire architects and engineers to give us assessments so that, again, it becomes a safety hazard and you protect the envelope of your school. I think the problem, you know, and a lot of this stems from the Lower Merion case, where they had an ungodly amount of money, and that is an extremely wealthy school district. That is not reflective of a Brownsville, a Chartiers, Houston, you know, Wilkinsburg, and so forth. So I think the limit is hard to take, but I think it's better to say what you're going to use it for. I don't like to have a lot of unassigned, because people mistakenly think we can utilize that. Well, just hire a person out of that. Again, it goes back to sustainability. I'll take a fund balance out to put it into single item costs. Hey, we need an HVAC repair. We have to buy an emergency boiler. But I'm not going to touch that to hire personnel. That's going to become on the staff, and I got to pay benefits and retirement. Now, we can do services, but everything that the district does, if you want to maintain the quality of your program, it has to be underlined with the priority in the budget and has to be sustainable. So that fund balance, to me, where we have it, you know, and for us, again, that's 4%, but that's going to be used for capital improvements. So again, I don't want to have to raise millage because I have an older population and it's talking about shifting the tax burden. But as far as like an upper limit, that's going to depend, you know, to exceed the limit, I have to go and get a voter referendum after Act 1. I don't want to do that either. I don't think that's fair. But when things like PlanCon are shut down and we're not getting reimbursement from the Commonwealth, that makes it difficult. And I'll tell you what, Keith will tell you, any kid from a district that's less affluent than, say, a Mount Lebanon or an Upper St. Clair, they know it. They know it better than the adults know it. And they compare themselves, and that, you know, is a apples and apples comparison with, well, gee, look at this auditorium, and look at ours, and look at this heating system. And, you know, some things aren't, it's never going to be, and I don't expect it to be, the same as everybody has an Upper St. Clair or Mount Lebanon facility, but I also don't want to be in the other end where we're not providing classrooms to meet the needs of the learners, whether it's like a sensory classroom for an autistic support student or it's a student in advanced placement and we're providing Calc 2.
Thank you. Dr. Hartbauer, if I could, two quick questions. One, you talked about regular education costs versus special ed costs, particularly for cyber school students. Do you find that the cyber schools are, I'll call it cherry picking, but, you know, picking the kid that has $2,000 worth of service needs and getting reimbursed $20,000 versus taking the kid that actually has $35,000 worth of special ed needs and getting reimbursed $25,000 for it?
Again, I'm not here to critique the cyber or the charters, but I can tell you some things that are factual information that we were dealing with. We recently had a charter school start in our area, and they had their charter approved, and there were some procedural things that we weren't all involved with or aware, okay? There were some things that were being sold about what this charter school is, and I'll give you an example from Brownsville. The first year we had one student go there. Within a short period of time, that child was then identified and the costs went up. This year we now have 16. And I know for sure that they don't even have the special education resources that they're claiming that they're getting that money for, okay? The neighboring district had about 12 students enter the first year and now has 61 students enrolled there. Those are huge hits on small school budgets. So to answer your questions, I can't give you a definitive, but I can tell you from a standpoint as a superintendent, there needs to be more clear-cut procedures, policies, and check-ins for these schools so what they say they are providing, they are actually providing. Because in the end, an example in this charter was that 80% this charter is being held within a public school, 80% goes back to the public school, and only, so if they're charging us $10,000, all right, $8,000 is going back to the public school for the facilities for rent, and only $2,000 is legitimately going to that student. So that's where I have the issues from a ethical standpoint, that there needs to be a better checks and balance in place. If there's a better checks and balance in place, then public schools have a better chance of surviving.
Okay. And one final question, if I could, because you mentioned the child that goes home to find a caregiver OD'd, and I know about 10 years ago I was out here in Fayette County for a meeting related to opioid addiction. It was at the sort of height of the opioid crisis, and at the time I was just awestruck because the local hospital testified and said that 50% of all babies born in that hospital were addicted at birth. This is something that affects everybody across the entire state, but I think has particularly hit rural areas hard, where you don't expect to have the sort of trauma that's inflicted by the drug problems and things like that. And the people say, oh, that only occurs in the big cities, but you guys get hit like extremely hard by that, and then have to deal with those kids who now are coming to school as a 5-year-old starting out life addicted, and have all those issues going on at home. I mean, their ACEs scores are through the roof when they show up at age 6, as opposed to, oh gosh, it's just a great panacea of kids, like they walk in and things are lovely at age 6. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
And I can, because I think that was, like, as I said, that had changed my whole perspective, was that story that I shared with you, that the mental health component of that, and the children, we're not, if you want me to win the Kentucky Derby, you have to allow me to put a thoroughbred in the gate to have a chance, right? Well, if we're not getting thoroughbreds to begin with, it makes life a lot more difficult. So then how do we get that percentage at the tail end? If you're saying about graduation rate, right? We all want the graduation rate. We're all educators. We all want to do well, like Dr. Martin said, and provide lifelong learners. But we have to be judged in a way that is fair to our particular situation. And I think that's where that comes down to. So yes, we are seeing that the significance of mental health issues that we're seeing come in our doors is huge, and that exhausts a lot of our resources, a lot of our financial resources. And I'll be honest with you, our teachers and our people, they're exhausted. And they're not exhausted because they don't want to do what they're doing. They're exhausted because of all the other things that are now placed on them as educators that was never there before. To answer your question.
Thank you.
May I add something to that?
Yeah.
Because you really struck a nerve here. So with mental health, IU1, like many IUs, we specialize in mental health services, which some people will confuse as special education. It's not. I mean, these are kids that don't have an IEP. Maybe they do, but we have seen. We started operating mental health outpatient clinics roughly 7 or 8 years ago. We have seen since the pandemic where our numbers have they've quadrupled in terms of families and students that are being seen. The problem that we have in our programs is that we can't get families there because of transportation. We have to go out and do those home visits, which is okay. But then we also have staffing issues as well. And so, not that you want to hear our woes, but I speak for other IUs across the state. I meet with them all the time, right? So, and you know what's really upsetting? I have to tell you, it's really upsetting when you're operating these specialized programs and you have superintendents calling you saying, I have a kid that's in need and I need you to help him. And I have to say, my loads are full in every classroom, and until I can hire a teacher, I can't take that kid. That, to me, is the worst thing I can tell these guys and ladies. That's really what we should be doing. But the reality of it is, and they're great, we work so well together at IU1. I'm happy to say that, through a lot of recruiting, we're getting more and more staffing, and we're opening up more programs, but that problem does exist.
Thank you, Representative. Turn next to Representative Warner for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here today. Today and throughout the course of this hearing, there's been a lot of robust discussion about funding in schools, The matter at hand, though, is the basic education funding formula, right? It's unconstitutional, and I know that there's been a lot of discussion about generally just an increase in funding for schools. However, if we go back to the courts and just say we're going to increase funding in schools, our basic education funding formula is still unconstitutional. And there can be a discussion about the right amount of money to fund our schools. I do know that, and look at Pennsylvania spends more than $5,500 more per student on average than other states in our country. Should it be more, should it be less? That's a separate discussion, but I want to look specifically at this formula, and a couple things that were brought up that got my attention were the words shifting the tax burden and also shrinking tax base. So we're looking at specifically funding our schools and the way that we do it from the state and from locally. Do you have any insights or thoughts? Can you expand on that? I mean, is it more fair to get rid of local funding and have it completely done from the state? And as we mentioned earlier, going to a per student funding based on other needs. Could you guys just expand on? I know it was brought up a couple of times, just on your thoughts on that shifting tax burden and the often shrinking tax base that we do have here in rural Pennsylvania.
Well, I don't think you can totally eliminate the local tax burden. But I do think with an aging population that are in fixed income and smaller homes, they're not going to be able to bear the brunt of additional millage increases. And if you've seen that in other districts, just constantly to increase the millage rate, eventually that's going to drag people out, and people aren't going to move into the community the way you want them to. So, on a I think some of the issue is with the deadlines. If we're getting students rolling over the summer, so, we'll do kindergarten registration in March and April. And then in central office, where the central registration is, we'll get people come in July and August and early September to sign up for schools, blowing up the classrooms and shifting our teacher-to-student ratio. And you can't say, well, we already passed our budget, you're not allowed to come and register here for school. So then to me is where do you get additional revenue streams from? And I've read articles where people have talked anything about, a portion of the sales tax, portion of, an earned income tax that would go into it. Whatever that would be, I think is a larger discussion, and I'm not a tax expert, but the idea to look for a stream that's not so heavily weighted on property tax. Our $23 million revenue, $14 million of which is all local. That's great if I have young families moving in and I have new construction, which blessedly right now I do. At other districts I've been at, which are landlocked, there's nowhere to build. Or there's no businesses coming in that you can look to have tax revenue from that. Out in Greensburg-Salem, for example, Salem Township, people didn't want water lines coming out into the township because they didn't want to do new building there. People are very proud of their family farms going back there to the 1800s. And they didn't want development, even though Route 22 goes right through it. So where are you getting the money from? Because you're mandated, right? Especially with, we've talked about special ed, but you're mandated with different title programs to provide IDEA to provide services for those students. So I don't think you throw the baby out with the bathwater totally on local because it is the community school. Every Friday night in Western Pennsylvania, people come out with pride to their high school and their community, and that goes from, the prom, the band, marching band, all that stuff that people are positive with. That's what people see. They see your facilities. They see those programs. But the recruiting process for teachers, the textbook selection process, the testing that you have to do to evaluate students, like we talked, how many students are coming in that may be thought to be for special needs or may have mental health concerns. What programs do we have? That's something the public may not necessarily see because it's not as visible, but that's the core of our operation. So, from my view, it's got to be how are you looking at revenue streams, again, that are sustainable? Basing it on an elderly population that's getting older, that, to me, that's not sustainable.
From Brownsville's perspective, I guess there's two. From the superintendent of Brownsville, if the state came in and they gave a certain percentage, that would be an advantage for us, all right? But with the pushback, I get it, because in the township that I live in, all right, that is sustainable, the politics that are involved with that, that's never going to happen, okay? So that's that situation. And I've said, we talked about fund balances and so forth. We're really, and I've said this to our own administrators, we're only 1 or 2 critical needs special education student away from being broke. If I get a student that has significant needs, that starts out in kindergarten or first grade and has to go to some therapeutic center in downtown Pittsburgh, transportation to and from there, that'll deplete any funds that we have. I'm more of an outcomes-based person, so to tell you where the numbers should go and the math part of it, I'm going to shy away from. But I would like to offer the committee 2 things. One is involve educators in this process. Have the educators be a part of looking at the formula. And I'm going to give you an example. During COVID, everything was pushed back on the superintendents and said, well, you do what you want to do for your school district, and we took the heat of whatever the situation, mask, unmask, vaccine, unvaccine, come to school, don't come to school. All that was put on our plates. Shortly after COVID was over, a mandate came through from the state that said now the kids can repeat their senior year. Not one superintendent was ever asked about that. Not one person looked at it. What if the entire class came back? How do we fund that? How do we support that? That decision was made without any input from us. So on one end, things are thrown on you. On the other end, they don't ask for input. So I would suggest that a committee of rural, city schools, all those type of things, somehow gets put together, that educators are involved in this process, and I think that you would have a better outcome.
Thank you very much. Recognize Ms. Krug for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Martin, you mentioned that the current formula doesn't necessarily respond very quickly to some quickly changing demographics. You mentioned, an unexpected influx of English as a second language learners coming into the district. Throughout these hearings, we've also heard that we actually maybe need to look at some factors over a longer period of time so that we're not creating fiscal cliffs, that ultimately the funding is predictable, it's stable. We've heard over and over that those are 2 very important things for school districts as you're creating budgets. I wonder if you could offer some thoughts on how we should think about balancing being responsive to events like that with the ongoing predictability and stability.
I appreciate that question because really when you take a look, I think it goes back to Representative Warner's question as well on how do you take the burden off the local taxpayer? And when you take a look at the burden, a lot of that has to do with these unintended expenses or these unexpected expenses, like English language learners that are moving into a district and like special education costs. I mean, I'll give you an example. At one time I was a superintendent of the Fraser School District, and unfortunately we had unfortunately we had a student go blind, a current student that was in our middle school at the beginning of the year, and we had another blind student move in. And that resulted in somewhere around $150,000 of unexpected costs. So, again, preaching to the choir when we talk with superintendents about this. But I think when you take a look at that, and maybe this sounds very elementary, but I think we need to take a look at having some funding that's available there at the time, rather than that rolling average. I think is really important, and I think you should take a look at that over time if that trend exists. But a lot of times in rural schools, you see that, as you mentioned, that pivot where it goes up and then it's back down again, and it's good for 5 years, and all of a sudden there's $400,000, like the Charleroi School District in the superintendent. So I think there needs to be those buckets of funding where we could absolutely assist those districts for that time period, because that throws their entire budget off then. And now then they have to make up, and they have to kind of chase their tails afterwards. And I think that's the spiraling problem with many rural school districts, is because of those unexpected costs, they're trying to make up for it in other areas.
I appreciate that. You all obviously have competing priorities. We do as well, so I appreciate your context there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Isaacson for a question.
Yes, and I will be quick. First of all, I do want to thank all of you. Again, as I stated earlier, it's truly is amazing coming from the large urban school district how the same issues plague us all. I just have a higher population in a smaller geographic area to your smaller population in a larger geographic area. But we're all in this Commonwealth together, and we all do have the goal of lifelong learners. That is our job, to educate and make sure that that's the result. And so my very quick question, because I got to keep this brief, is to you, Dr. Martin. You spoke about the collective school districts that you have working together. And one of the things you brought up in your testimony was trying to collaborate for cost savings because of the issues that face your school district, the smaller tax base. And I think I heard you talk about like facilities for maintenance. Are those like contracts you're trying to all enter into together, or could you explain that a little bit?
Certainly. Well, first of all, the shared services, and really, it's not like we're reinventing the wheel. That's what we do in intermediate units, and that's what we see and we encourage with our districts. They do that on their own, as I mentioned before. So what I was merely suggesting was a more coordinated effort, where there are some things where we can have folks, I don't want to say force folks into that, but certainly provide some incentives. Because the number one thing that people will tell me is, I would love to partner with a district 8 miles down the road, but I can't get my kids there. Or we need money for the AP teacher, or we need more technology to be able to do so. So I think really taking a look at those costs for those shared services is really important. In terms of the facilities, we don't necessarily share facilities other than outside of these districts. They have their own. But certainly, I think as Dr. Peiffer had mentioned, you walk into some of these facilities and, our kids will go to basketball games from a small rural school, and it's almost like the movie Hoosiers, for those of you that are old enough to remember that, where they walk in and they go, wow, this is a gym. And because there are some really awesome high schools and structures that we have in IU1, but I don't want to trivialize this, but we do suffer in terms of facilities.
I think you're touching right upon what I was going at earlier with our first speaker of what message psychologically are you sending to children with the facilities that you send them in. And the collaboration I was trying to figure out was, should there be a contract, or maybe you could get a better price if they know they're going to be working on the daily maintenance or significant maintenance on different schools if it's a company within the area. So that was just one of my thoughts. But and technology, if you can do bulk buying as a group together, that's something else. Thought process. But again, we're running behind, so I'm not going to take up too much.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for your testimony, all of you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Ortiz.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I promise to be brief. I just wanted to say thank you to the three of you. I know I've worked with Dr. Peiffer a lot over the last year, Dr. Martin as well over the last several years, and I'd be remiss, I saw Lena Hanna come in, who's joined us too, who always makes sure that us as local legislators are paired with not only our superintendents, but our school board members and IUs as well. So thank you for the three of you for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Deputy Secretary Bitterer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate everybody joining us today and your service. I think that this panel did a great job of illustrating some of the challenges of rural education and what you're really facing in your classrooms. Our first testifier talked about evidence-based practices, and that as policymakers, we should look to drive towards those, that we should pair increased money with also policy levers that'll make sure it's spent really effectively. And so I was thinking about evidence-based practices and knowing that, of course, you're all very familiar and you've implemented many in your districts, in your school buildings. I was thinking about if it would be possible for you to give us some examples of maybe some evidence-based practices that you would like to invest in but haven't been able to this point, and what kind of impact those things might have on your students.
Well, I guess I'll start this, and I mentioned this before. I think when you take a look, I'd mentioned the mental health crisis, and I think that's huge. So when you look at evidence-based practices, it's really frustrating that it comes down to funding. And again, I'll refer you to one of the poorer counties with Greene County, where we have one of our highest mental health populations, where districts are working together constructively and collectively to get that done. But we would like to see policies that center around that, because obviously every student, every family needs to be addressed in the areas of mental health. And so I think that's a huge area and a huge passion coming from an IU perspective. And I'll defer to my colleagues for other areas.
One of the things that we're dealing with right now, actually this year, are, and it coordinates with the whole mental health piece, is restorative practices, right? The evidence-based things, and we're spending the year to educate our teachers to then roll it out for the kids the following year. But when you look at that, and I'll just use that one specific area, from a standpoint, from a financial standpoint, how can we do this? How do we get the money to provide the staff the critical training that they need, that it's just not a surface thing, and it's just not one of those things, well, this is just the next thing coming through, and in 2 years from now it's going to be something else. So the sustainability of it becomes a major part of the process as well. So I think when we look at those types of things, the professional development, the restorative practices, if you will, I think that those are all great and evidence-based, but how do we get our teachers to get that training that they need to have to make sure that it works? It can be evidence-based, but if you don't know how to do it, it's not going to work in the end anyway.
Thank you.
I think one of the things I'd like to add too, you know, we all know how critical effective professional development is on the practice, and that none of our institutions are effective if we don't have well-trained teachers. We know that to embed that, it has to be job related, it has to be rigorous, it has to be something that's ongoing. Too often, we'll get mandates that'll come from the Commonwealth. Well, you got to provide suicidal awareness training. Well, you have to provide this for Act 55. Well, you have to provide a modular training on literacy, and on and on and on. And we're limited with how many days professional development we can provide. What I've ever seen effective practices, it's been teachers working with teachers and administrators working with them to go over student academic performance. Is the diagnostic assessment working? What are you intervening with as far as instruction at a Tier 2 level in an MTS system or Tier 3? We know that those work. And there's, you know, the NCTEE has information, the National Economics Council, and they compare those world education systems like in Finland, and you know, everybody that goes through initial courses as a superintendent has taken those courses. And it comes back to how effective are you in developing your staff and teachers so that they can be the best they can be for students. And I would say that's an evidence-based practice that would help us. It would help teachers with dealing with mental health services for students who are having outbursts in classroom. It would help struggling students. You know, for us, when we get evaluated with the Future Ready Index and we get evaluated on the test scores, in addition to that performance level, there's also the growth. And I stress to my team, I want to focus on the growth. What difference, what's the delta, as my friends in commerce say, that you're moving a student by the benefit of that student being in your class. So that effective professional development so that it's ongoing and not a, you know, this, we have a new administration in the governor's office and now we're going to focus on this initiative. I think that for people who've been in the field a long time, I think that gets frustrating for them and then harder to just go out there with your sleeves rolled up for new professional development.
And I'll just kind of end it with this. When we talk about evidence-based, all the data and research shows the number one indicator in a child's success is the physical teacher that they have, all right? The teacher in front of them directing the instruction, you know, doing those types of things are the number one indicator whether that child's going to be there. And we need to be able to invest more into our teachers so that they can continue their journey as a lifelong learner as well.
Thank you very much. And a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and rapid fire at you. So I'll be quick, you be quick. It would be really helpful. Testimony today indicated that school districts should share and should coordinate services. We see a lot of that happening through the IUs, AP course exams, mental health, technology, things like that. Do you believe that it would be in the best interest of the Commonwealth and its school districts to incentivize the sharing of services or even the consolidation of school districts?
Well, and you know, we all know that we take a look at our school districts. I mean, I'd mentioned that they're 6, 8, 10 miles apart. And so the quick answer to that is yes. I mean, I think there needs to be a coordinated effort in terms of shared services, and that should be incentivized with a reflection to the funding formula on how districts can better utilize services, how they can utilize educational service agencies like an IU. I don't want this to sound like a public service announcement for IUs, because they have expertise in their own districts that we can learn from. And so that's really, really important. I'm not going to go as far as saying that, you know, when you look at school consolidations, because, there's a thing called local control that is very, very important to Pennsylvanians. And they have that very near and dear. When you take a look at the history of consolidations, I think we've had 2 in the past 20 or 25 years. So it's not something that just happens. But also, I will tell you that I do hear school districts saying that, or I do talk to superintendents talking about that, off-the-record conversations, and the conversation centers around, well, that district may not want us to become part of that, or that district may not want us to have those shared services. Because many of our districts center, just because we're Washington Green and Fayette County, we border Westmoreland, we border Allegheny, and some of those districts are closer in that proximity. So I hope that makes sense, that when I talk about a coordinated effort, not talking about jumping in both feet and saying, yeah, we need to consolidate schools, but certainly consolidating the services and incentivizing that is something that's important.
Can I add to that?
Absolutely.
So for coordinated service, so for example, and I'm working with Mr. Martin and IU1 currently on providing school nursing services. You have to have a certified school nurse to carry a caseload, I believe, of 1,500 students. Well, we're over that. I need a certified school nurse then to help with the overflow of students. Not a registered nurse, not a licensed nurse, a licensed practicing nurse, but it has to be a certified school nurse. So again, as we got more students, and I'm like, well, what are we looking at? Hiring a new person for the number of kids that are over? Or can I work with Mr. Martin and Dr. Martin and IU1 with a school nurse network, which that's the solution that we're coming up with to be responsible for the taxpayers. So those types of discussions, whether it's staffing in the business office, I think there are some services that can be consolidated and that you can share. And I think, the IUs are a great engine to do that, especially in a rural area.
We're currently working with another local school district too. For an example, foreign language. If we only have one, if my foreign language teacher is Spanish and Mr. Smith is French, the ability to share that. So if there was an incentive that would help us to offset some of those costs to share with local districts, then I think that would be a benefit. As Dr. Martin said, the local control issue is a major hurdle that you would have to think about as far as consolidations. And I can tell you, just in my 35 years in education, that the hurdle is not so much going to be the educational component, but it's going to be determine what the mascot's going to be if you do that. Okay.
Having served as a school board director, we got more interest about a wrestling coach than we did a high school principal. So I empathize and understand where you are coming from. Thank you for that insight. One last question, and it has to do with the funding formula itself. So many small rural school districts would be negatively impacted by eliminating the hold harmless provision that as it exists now and distributing all of the funding through that newer, what they call the FAIR formula, enacted in 2015, that's only to this point been driving out any new and additional dollars after 2015 to school districts. What would the impact of eliminating the hold harmless provision be on your districts?
For Brownsville, it's close to $2 million. It's like $1.5 million, $1.7 million that it would negatively impact us, which in a sense would be our whole mental health component of things that we're using for our kids that I testified is so important.
And to echo that, we'd be in a position we'd have to cut programs. And, again, we're mandated to balance the budget. We can't deficit spend. So we would have very limited options, and if you start cutting away programs, you really start cutting away at the quality of the product you're putting out as young men and women.
And you're looking nearly half of our districts that are receiving that level of funding, so at IU1. So really, when you take a look, I echo what these superintendents are saying, that there's programs that are going to be cut and services will be cut if you take that funding formula away.
Thank you. Recognize the good gentleman from Philadelphia. I understand he's at Abbott Elementary today. Is that correct?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And the streak continues. Hopefully the same will be tonight at Citizens Bank Park, but that's another story for another get-together. First of all, thank you to our testifiers for bringing forth some very compelling information. Question I have, I think, is really simple. Dr. Hartbauer, the Professor Kelly, who did the analysis and has been accepted as the expert, according to the Commonwealth Court Judge Jubileer, utilized his data, his information to make her decision, said that the Brownsville School District is facing a shortfall of about $8,600, and I think the exact number is $8,682.34 per student, which essentially says that your district, your students deserve to have, in order to be constitutional, in order to be adequate, to meet adequacy, another $8,682.34 per student. I think my question is real simple. What would you do if you had that money? If you had an additional $8,682.34 per student, what would you do?
Well, I think you take it from a vast I use the word balcony view, right? I think that you have to look at this. We share textbooks. Our third, fourth, and fifth graders, as we rotate kids, we share textbooks. So the ability to have every child to have their own textbook, their own workbooks, those types of things from an instructional standpoint, the professional development part, the mental health piece of things that go into it, all the different things from a facility standpoint. If we didn't have the federal money, putting $4 million into our HVAC, where was that going to come from if that didn't happen? So the level up part of things, when you look at from a constitutional standpoint of every child having the same opportunity. I give an example. When I left New Jersey and moved my family to southwestern Pennsylvania, the students where I was leaving, when they were doing a biology class, they were sticking a toothpick into the frog on a dissection and then labeling it, right? The district that I was able to move to is now taking a probe and putting it on the heart, and it comes up on a big screen and talks about blood pressure and everything else. So how is that fair? I mean, so I think that money would then level out that playing field and allow the children of Brownsville to have the same opportunities. How other school districts use their resources or they go about things, that's up to them. But from a standpoint from Brownsville, I think it gives them the opportunity to succeed at a level that any other child would have as well.
And I asked that question. I thank you very much. I asked you that question because I think it's if we've got the data, if we've got the numbers, they're accepted as the expert testimony by the president judge of Commonwealth Court who made the ruling in a 786-page decision. If all of that is the case, then really in many respects it comes down to, here are the numbers, how do we get them to you, and what would you do with the money? Right. Okay? We know, I spend a lot of time focused on grade level literacy, grade level mathematics. We know far too many students across Pennsylvania are suffering in both of those areas. It's just not hitting the mark that we need them to hit. And so the question ultimately again comes to, if we're able to get you the resources, what would you invest in? What would you spend it on? I know in the Chartiers, Houston, I hope I'm saying that correctly, please forgive me if I'm not, district, I think the number is more like $1,314.81 per student. The questions that becomes to that what legislators are going to want to know, rightfully so, what would the additional money be invested in? And it's important that you're able to help us understand what those dollars would be used for.
Sure, and I could say at Chartiers Houston, we would continue our investment in technology resources for the students. We continue to provide services for students who are either homeless, struggling with mental health issues. We bring contracted services in. We've recently contracted with Associates in Wellness to provide additional family and student mental health counseling. So those items we'd focus directly to the students so that it goes for services that they need that otherwise we may not be able to provide.
Very helpful. Again, the question is, what would the investment be? I'm sorry, for the third gentleman.
Thank you, Senator. I just wanted to add, from our perspective as an educational service agency, when you ask that question, automatically my mind goes to the school district's comprehensive planning process. And so when you take a look at that, every year, and obviously these two gentlemen can disagree with me, but every 5 years when you do those comprehensive plans, you're basing it on your socioeconomic status. I mean, you're basing those things. You can't have, everyone wants those lofty goals, and we could put them down as goals, but they're never going to get attained. And so that's a game changer. When you take a look at these things, rather than saying, what are we going to do in the immediacy, you take a look at how does that reflect our comprehensive plan. And that also has a big impact on the community because in those comprehensive plans, or that process involves community focus groups. And now you can go back and say, look, we have some stakeholders here who can actually contribute to a Brownsville and how we get that $8,000 initially additionally for students. And so I think that creates a whole different environment with that. But I did want to bring out that comprehensive planning process because that's so important in terms of taking a look at the goals as it relates to the district budgets.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Peiffer. Thank you all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. One last very quick question. A lot of conversation about facilities. Do your school districts conduct school facility studies and school facilities assessments to gauge school facility needs and assess the condition of their facilities? And if you do, how often do you do them?
I would say this is an ongoing internal thing that we do. Again, it comes down to cost to afford somebody to come in and to do a study. Often weighs into the decision where we are and what we're going to do and how we move forward. So most of that is done internally just because of limited resources to be able to do it from an outside expertise company, if you will.
Thank you.
Yes, I would say the same. I'm only in beginning my third year at Chartiers Houston. When I was at Greensburg Salem, they paid an architect to do an extensive study into facility needs, and they made recommendations for all the buildings, just 5 buildings there. That cost about $10,000 for the district at that time to do that. So I think to echo what Dr. Hartbauer said, I think a lot of districts do that internally unless they're planning for new construction.
Thank you. With that, I want to thank you all for your testimony here today and appreciate your willingness. We recognize you have a lot of things on your plates and that you've taken the time to come and be with us. We really do appreciate it. Thank you. So last but certainly not least, hailing from the Great Northwest, we have Brian Polito, Superintendent of the Erie City School District. Would like to welcome him to provide testimony to the Commission. And before you sit down, Mr. Polito, if you could raise your right hand and we'll swear you in. Do you swear that the testimony you are about to provide here today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And if so, please indicate by saying I do. Very good. Thank you so much. And please begin your testimony when you are ready.
Thank you. Well, my name's Brian Polito. I'm the superintendent of the Erie School District. It's the largest school district in Erie County. And I come to you today with, I think, a unique perspective on things because I've had experience as a business manager and a superintendent. I've worked in school districts that have benefited from hold harmless, and I've worked in a school district, my current one, that has been severely harmed by it. So I do have a different perspective than some of my colleagues, and I want to share that today. Erie County is kind of unique with the way it's set up. Erie is one of the biggest cities in the state, and it's surrounded by a number of suburban and rural school districts. And over the last 25 years, since the basic ed formula was not based on a per pupil amount, during that time, most of the school districts in Erie County saw a reduction in their enrollment of 20 to 30%, while at the same time, Erie School District saw an increase of about 13%. So my first 15 years in public education, I worked as a business manager and then as assistant superintendent in 2 school districts that were benefiting from hold harmless and saw that reduction. Until I got to Erie, I was completely unaware of how hold harmless and the current formula really was negatively impacting a lot of school districts across the state. The first school district I worked at, I started there in about 2000, and at that point, they just started to see their decline in enrollment. They actually had a feasibility study done for a renovation project across the district, and that was projecting an increase in enrollment in that school district. So they billed out for an increase in enrollment, but instead they saw about a 30% reduction in enrollment over the last 20 years. So over that time, because of that, and similar to a lot of school districts that are in the county, not in the city, they've been able to artificially keep their real estate taxes lower. That school district actually, even though they built for more capacity than they needed, were able to pay off their debt service completely the last couple years. The second school district I worked for was more of a rural suburban school district. It also, during my tenure there, saw a decrease in enrollment of probably about 20%. And it really made my job as a business manager a lot easier. I didn't realize it at the time, but every year we saw a decrease in enrollment to the point where I was able to eliminate 2 teachers through attrition. And when you look at that as far as our budget, that meant that we didn't have to increase real estate taxes by 2%. So, for example, if we needed a 3% tax increase, we could eliminate the 2 teachers, and we only had to do a 1% tax increase during that time period. When I got to the city of Erie, it was completely different, a completely different animal. We're living in an alternate reality in the city because we have been severely impacted by hold harmless over the last 25 years. When I got there, my first board meeting, and I have this in my testimony, it's a true story. We had a bunch of parents come from one of our elementary schools. It was one of our top performing elementary schools, complaining because we had to put buckets in the aisles in between the kids in classrooms because we couldn't replace the roof on the building. We were able to pull together enough money to do that, but across the district, that's what our facilities were like. When I got there too, coming from the county, I thought I could come in and cut costs and help the district out. And what I found when I got there was they had shuttered buildings. They had eliminated about 250 full-time positions. They decimated their central office, really cut to the point where our spending per pupil was in the bottom 10% in the state. And despite that, we were facing multi-million-dollar deficits and nowhere else to cut, nowhere else to cut. And that's in 2017 when we started advocating for the additional $14 million that we received. I think we made the case that because of that, we had done everything we could as a school district to balance our budget, and we needed some assistance. And since that time, with the $14 million and the additional adjustments that we've received with Level Up, it's been very helpful for us. We're not in crisis mode anymore. We've been able to stabilize our finances. We're finally, for the first time in 25 years, have been able to refresh our curriculum across the district. And we're also in the middle of a multi-million-dollar facilities plan to make our schools warm, safe, and dry. So it's a lot better than it was, but we still have a serious amount of needs across the district. And in my testimony, one thing that I do want to point out is how this hold harmless approach has really hurt school districts, and I understand completely that there's 350 school districts across the state that would be harmed by eliminating it immediately. But if you look at the number of pupils that are in school districts that are hurt by hold harmless, it's over 56%, just like my school. Half the pupils in the state are being hurt by this method of funding schools. And I really am encouraging this committee to tackle that somehow through this, and I know it's a big challenge, but I do think there is a blueprint out there with what happened with PARSS in 2010 when they adopted, I believe it was Act, I can't remember, Act 120 of 2010. They created this 25-year plan to tackle the underfunded liability in PARSS. For the 10 years prior to that, we really weren't funding PARSS. They put that into effect. They cut some benefits. We're about halfway to fully funding PARSS right now, and it's been painful. It really has. But if we hadn't done that back in 2010, the Commonwealth would not be in the position they are today. So I would really encourage this commission to really take a look at something like that. It took us 25 years to break the basic ed funding formula. It may take us that long to fix it, because I do fully understand as well that the state is faced with some structural deficits down the road, and it's going to be very difficult to find the funding to make everybody whole.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Polito. Representative Sturla for a question.
So there's two ways to go about looking at the hold harmless issue. One is to say we eliminate it and eliminate it over 25 years. I don't think you would advocate for eliminating it immediately because it's just too devastating to school districts. You can eliminate it over 25 years. The other thing is to look at changing the base, because the hold harmless was a base that was built in 2013 with numbers that were the worst equitably proportioned numbers of any state in the nation. So if we would go back and restructure the base and say we're not necessarily going to hurt any district that is a hold harmless district, but if we raise the base for everybody else that was inadequately funded, I can now, in one sense, hold harmless becomes irrelevant, because the district that was up there getting more than they should have, even though I don't think it's more than they should have, because it was still only 50% of their total costs versus the other people at 22% or 12% or whatever. But if so, I mean, can you see that would be something that would be helpful also, sort of on the immediate factor, to say I'll make hold harmless irrelevant by increasing that base enough that you're going to get those dollars guaranteed in that base. You saw that happen with your school district when they increased your base enough in one sense, it didn't matter that some other districts were getting some because you were at least getting what you needed. And so if we could increase the base enough, and even then if I say, and then I'm going to eliminate hold harmless over 25 years, the amount I'm eliminating in hold harmless is much smaller by comparison than what it is now. Because right now the difference between somebody else's base and a hold harmless base is still pretty dramatic.
Yeah, I really would advocate for setting a base because that's really going to move away from the per pupil allocation period. And again, the examples that I showed in a school district that sees a 30% drop in enrollment, I just don't think it would be fair for them to keep the same exact base.
Okay.
I think, that should be taken into consideration, the number of students.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Schweier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sir, I think Erie is actually a pretty interesting case study because, in fact, it has had a case study done on it. So in 2000, I think it was 2015, right, that you got the bump, the $14 million adjustment. 17. Okay, I'm sorry. And as part of that, there was a study done, correct, as a I don't want to categorize it this way, but as a sort of early intervention sort of case study based on that $14 million, correct?
We were put into Financial Watch,
Right.
Which came with a financial administrator that we worked with to develop a financial plan.
Okay. Who was the financial administrator?
Charles Zogby.
Former Secretary of Education?
Yes.
And the conclusions that former Secretary Zogby drew, the $14 million, it stabilized your school district, correct?
Yes.
Coupled with the level up funding, the added BEF, added SEF, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and now you're in a much better place.
Yes.
How are your, I want to be careful with these metrics, but standardized test scores, graduation rates, transiency, all of those sorts of things, how's the school district doing now versus prior to that time period?
Improving. Again, we adopted.
Can you pull the mic just a little
I'm
closer?
Sorry.
Thank you.
I'm a bean counter by trade. My staff say I have not found
There's
my
not a
teacher
lot of
voice
not
yet.
dorks up here, so you're fine. So.
Yeah, so we did start adopting the curriculum in the middle of the pandemic.
Okay.
So that kind of paused things for 2 years, but we are starting to see some serious growth. Last year, our academic growth was in the top 10 in the state across the board, K through 8. And those are the areas that we had adopted the curriculum earliest. We also saw a pretty significant bump in graduation rates last year. We went from 72 to 76%.
Wow,
I can't say whether or
congratulations.
not that's going to continue. It may be an anomaly, but things are moving in the right direction now. But it's going to take time for us to recover. Again, we had 25 years where there was no curricular materials, no guidance. Our teachers were just getting by on rubber bands and Band-Aids trying to get the curriculum done.
Yeah, representing Allentown, I will say that we're currently this year starting to implement new curriculum, and certainly hopeful we have similar positive successes. One last thing, sir, again, going back to the case study authored by former Education Secretary Charles Zogby, he goes on length, and in case anybody's wondering, I did read this, because, again, this is stage full of dorks. Mary excluded. Only because she's sitting next to me and she scares me. In the best way. He mentioned one of your major cost drivers was charter schools. Do you remember what specifically his suggestions were regarding charter schools? Because this matters for the BEF, because as we all know, there's a BEF weight in there for charter school penetration, but it generates $32 million, and we have $3-ish billion of charter school expenses. What was former Secretary Zogby's recommendations about the charter schools?
That was our main initiative, was to stabilize charter enrollment, because we were seeing approximately 60 students per year leave for charter. So our goal was to get that down to 30 students a year, which would help stabilize our finances. We have been able to do that. Over the last couple years, we've stabilized charter enrollment. This year, we actually saw a decrease in enrollment overall. We had to close one of our brick and mortar charter schools. That did contribute to it, but the majority of those students did choose to come back to Erie's public schools, and I do attribute that to the increased investments that we were able to put into our curricular materials, into our buildings, into our technology, so we are becoming more competitive with those charter schools where we were not competitive before.
So just to recap, the Commonwealth helped the Erie School District achieve a level of financial stability, which allowed you to invest in curriculum and school buildings, and as a result, the competitive nature of the Erie School District has demonstrated that you've pretty dramatically slowed your charter school, your exodus of students to charter schools. Parents were choosing the Erie School District under this point, and as a result, and sort of the positive spiral is that you're also further in better financial footing and able to invest more.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Representative, and I'm going to ask you one last question. So you were able to implement evidence-based interventions for your students that helped create this turnaround in Erie schools. So what would you recommend be implemented with any new dollars to help drive similar types of academic achievement across the Commonwealth? I know you're a bean counter, but you funded these programs.
Yeah, well, I think for each school district it's going to be different. I think that a part of our success too was we recognized early on that we needed to really lean into long-term planning, and I know the state has really implemented a very comprehensive plan process, and you know, I think having school districts work with the state to identify strengths and challenges, looking at those challenges and working with them to identify programs or supports that they could implement that our research base would be the most effective.
Thank you. I know you had a long drive. We are reminded often by our colleagues from Erie how long it takes them to get to Harrisburg. I know it's really up there. So we appreciate that you drove down here today, and thank you for your testimony and sharing Erie's story.
Thank you.
So with that, I would like to thank all of today's testifiers, to all of those individuals from the public who have joined us in person and joined us virtually, as well as the staff here at Penn State Fayette campus. They have been very gracious in how they have hosted us and allowed us to use this facility. Our next commission meeting will be on Thursday, November 2nd in Enola, back down near Cumberland County. And all of the information that was provided here today, including testimony, can be found on the Commission's website, which is basiceducationfundingcommission.com. All comments that are submitted through the website are made publicly available and will be part of the Commission's report. And with that, I now recess this Commission until the call of the chairs. Thank you.